Good evening, everybody. Welcome. We are going to give it just another minute or so for people to finish logging in, and then we will get started soon. Thank you. Okay, good evening, everybody. We are going to get started. Welcome to Landscape Transformation Basics. My name is Scott Kleinrock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager here at the WaterWise Community Center, and I will be your presenter this evening. Thank you for spending a bit of your Thursday evening with us. A quick note before we jump into it. This presentation is available for download. So if you want to refer back to any of the images or slides or text that you see, you can download a single PDF file that has all of these slides at the URL on the screen, cbwcd.org/presentations. And I'm going to type that into the chat right now in case you aren't ready to write it down yet. So that's cbwcd.org/presentations. And that will bring you directly to a page that's just a list of links to similar downloads for all the presentations that we offer. So find the Landscape Transformation Basics one, and it's a pretty large file, so it might take a moment to download. The easiest thing to do would be to go to it and right-click and do Save Linked File As, and then you can get all of those slides. This is also being recorded, and after a light bit of editing, you will be able to rewatch this at cbwcd.org/YouTube. That brings you directly to the YouTube page with recordings of all of our past online workshops. So currently there's a very similar, slightly older version, just a few slides changed version of this presentation up there, and then eventually we'll get this one up there. But 90% of the content's exactly the same if you want to review it quicker than that, as well as check out our other recordings of many of our other online workshops. And I'm typing that URL into the chat right now as well, cbwcd.org/YouTube. Before we jump into the main presentation, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the organization that I come from. We are the WaterWise Community Center. Our formal name of our public agency is the Chino Basin Water Conservation District. We are a special district, so we're a local government agency similar to a school district or a fire district that was created by a public vote back in 1949 to provide specifically water conservation services, essentially to the western edge of San Bernardino County, sort of think Upland and Rancho Cucamonga in the north, down through the cities of Montclair, Chino, Ontario, and then Chino Hills in the very south. We don't provide anybody's water like at their house or their business, but we work very closely with the local water providers or the water retailers on water conservation programs. So we're a kind of unique organization. There are less than 10 water conservation districts in the state of California, and the vast majority of them are in more rural or agricultural regions. We say that our mission is threefold: to percolate, to demonstrate, and to educate. Percolation has sort of long been the bread and butter of what we do, and that is basically recharging our local groundwater basin through the use of these large infiltration basin properties. Most of these are literally old gravel pits in our area along now channelized kind of historic waterways, and so when it rains, they drain a lot of water through adjacent areas, kind of channelized systems. And so our agency has purchased these properties and re-engineered them essentially to bring in that water that would otherwise be lost to our communities and allow that through natural processes to percolate down. It gets cleaned through natural processes, and then it becomes part of our local water supply, helping recharge our local groundwater, which is huge because in our local area, our local groundwater provides about 60% of our water supply. It's a huge resource for any community in Southern California, and we essentially exist to help protect and steward that resource. And that's how we work on the supply side of water conservation. But as an urbanized area, we also know that we need to use water wisely on the demand side. It doesn't do all that much work to work on the supply if we're not also making sure we're using it wisely on the demand side. And we also know that, especially within our local residential communities, which is most of the landscape area within our service area, on average, about 60% of the water is used outdoors in the landscape. And so we do a lot of work in that arena to help people move towards and learn how to manage water-wise landscapes. And so whether that's how to optimally water a lawn so that it's healthy but not wasting any water, or moving towards more innovative, beautiful water-wise landscapes like we're going to talk about tonight. And so in that vein, we have a public demonstration garden here at our headquarters facility in Montclair, just south of the 10 freeway. And that is about 3 acres of demonstration landscapes, free and open to the public, 6 days a week, opened 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. every day except Sundays and major holidays. And we have free Wi-Fi, so come spend some time, bring some work to do if you just want to check it out and spend some time in it. Come have lunch in our beautiful garden. We also have a park at part of the facility with picnic tables, and come check out all the sorts of things we are talking about today. We also do lots of education for all sorts of different groups, from curriculum integrated K through 12 education to free workshops. We are in the new year going to start doing free workshops, also live, all outdoors in the garden. Again, after being on pause for quite a while due to COVID. So we're very excited about that. And for those of you who live within our local service area, we also have one-on-one programs for local community members, which I will talk about some later on. But the best thing you can do is check out our website at cbwcb.org, and you can find out all about those other services. And we also do professional training for landscape professionals. The best way to stay up to speed with everything that we do is to sign up for our monthly newsletter. If there's one thing you do from this presentation, I want you to sign up for this newsletter because that'll connect you to the whole realm of services and everything we offer. And you can do that at cbwcb.org/newsletter. I'm going to type that to the chat. cb.org/newsletter. And we don't share your email with anybody else. It's just one email a month, no junk, but just updates about all our free programs, what's going on at the Waterwise Community Center, as well as other resources. So we're almost to the beginning of the actual content. Thanks for going with me through the introduction material. I want to tell you just a little bit about who I am and why I'm talking to you about this. For those of you who've just joined us, my name is Scott Kleinerock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager here at the Waterwise Community Center. I have a background in the professional side of the landscape world. My academic training, I have a master's degree in landscape architecture from Cal Poly Pomona. Before I came to work at the Waterwise Community Center, I worked in the public gardens world for about 8 years. And before that, before I went back to school for landscape architecture, I did landscape maintenance, kind of just started from, learning the ropes, landscape maintenance, eventually did landscape management, and I've done a lot of landscape design, landscape construction management at the kind of public garden and commercial scale. But my passion, my favorite thing to do has always been just plain old DIY front yard, backyard projects. I love working with community members to transform their own spaces and to move from landscapes that really aren't that exciting and don't do that much for us to really, really beautiful, enriching spaces to spend our outdoor lives in. In Southern California, Even though it's hot part of the year, our evenings are beautiful, our mornings are beautiful. This time of year, our afternoons are beautiful. And for a lot of us, there's a lot of outdoor space, or when we don't have a lot of outdoor space, that outdoor space is precious. So I really love working with people to move towards not only more sustainable gardens, but gardens that do more for us. And so that's what we're going to be talking about this evening. So very last thing before we get started is I'm going to launch a quick opening poll where you all can tell me just a little bit about you for just a moment. It's just a few quick questions. Please just select the relevant answers. And that gives me a couple of things. It lets me know a little bit about you. And it also gives us some important metrics for tracking and reporting on our programs. So we'll give just a moment for that, and then we'll get started. Thank you very much, everyone. See that people are starting to finish up. For those of you who are joining us from other communities than are listed on question number 3, everybody's very welcome. We're happy to have you. Always very interested in where people are coming from. So when you're done with the poll, please type into the chat and let us know where you are. And about half of the people are done, so we'll give it just another moment or so. Someone is joining us. Okay, from Northern California, we have Oregon. So for those of you who are joining us from not Southern California, it'll be a glimpse into gardening in Southern California. Some of the principles that we're going to be talking about today, including the design process we're going to talk about a lot, turf removal, certainly are going to be relevant to you. The garden styles, and especially when you talk about plant selection, you're going to want to combine that with more local kind of knowledge. We're not going to talk a lot about individual plants today, so there will be a lot of relevance. And Highland Park, yeah, everything will be completely relevant. Okay, so as people finish up, I just quickly want to also let you know how to interact with me today. What we find is that we don't actually have people raise their hands and call on people because there's a lot of downtime with the audio. So the best way to ask questions, and I encourage you to ask questions, is to type them into the Q&A function. So in your little Zoom interface, there'll be a area that says Q&A, and it has 2 little text bubbles. That's the best way to answer or to ask questions. There's also the chat one, which just has 1 text bubble that's different. And if you have any comments or anything as we go along, feel free to type those into the chat. I always read those, especially at the end. But sometimes when questions go into the chat, it's harder for me on the back end on my interface to see those. But the Q&A keeps it all really nice and managed for me. And I can make sure I kind of check those off as I go and I answer those questions. And so to keep the flow of the workshop going, because there's a lot for us to cover tonight, what I'll do is I'll keep one eye on the questions coming in. And then in between sections, I'll stop and I'll catch up with answering questions. Thank you, everybody, for your answers to the polls. Just want to share a couple of things. These are always very interesting. The 2 questions of, if you've not planted a water-wise garden already, what has been stopping you? And that's very interesting. Tonight, our answers are quite a little bit different. Coming up with the design is always number 1, and we're going to talk, because of that, a lot about design tonight. Right now, that's tied also with finding a contractor, which is, I can't guide you on as much, but I definitely will give you some guidance for contractor. and money and project costs. So obviously, I can't directly help you with that, but for those of you in Southern California, we'll talk about the available rebates if you have turf and you're removing turf to put in a water-wise garden. And I'll give you some guidance, at least in our local area, of what we've been seeing lately with residential contractor costs. And then we'll talk a little bit about irrigation and watering, and I'll connect you with some of the resources that help you with some of the other aspects. Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for typing in, everybody. And so with that, we're going to jump into it. And our goal tonight is not going to be to turn you into a complete landscape expert. We just can't do that in the time we have together. So rather, my goal is going to be to give you a really solid introduction to everything I think you should be thinking about when you are considering embarking on a landscape transformation project. And so there will be a lot of content to get you going. And also, I'm going to do my best to connect you with additional resources and additional content to get all of the information you need to take your next steps. But to start things out, we're going to talk a little bit about why this might even be worth it. And it's going to start with the premise that in Southern California, landscapes actually take up quite a bit of space, especially in our typical suburban areas. If you look at the typical Southern California suburb from a satellite photo, say on Google Earth or something like that, it's very different than New York City or downtown Los Angeles. There's relatively a lot of green. At the ground level, sure, there might be too much asphalt, too much concrete in certain areas, but there's a significant amount of either green or dirt still. And for a long time, especially within the suburban front yard, really the question about landscapes has been, does it fit in with the neighbors? There's been that expectation for many, many decades, essentially since a lot of these houses were built with the building explosion in the 50s, that the typical landscape is going to be turf, lawn, maybe a shade tree, maybe some roses, and kind of a green blob of a hedge that just gets sheared every few weeks. And even for people who are maybe going to go a little bit beyond that, for the most part, for a long time, the main concern was sort of, what does it look like? Ornamental gardening. And what it looks like should be beautiful. Let's say that right now, we are not going to sacrifice aesthetics, and our new water-wise landscapes should be more beautiful than the landscapes that they're replacing. That's a minimum. But I think even more exciting than that is that the last series of droughts really opened up an opportunity for a deeper and more engaging question, which is, what do our landscapes do for us? They are precious space on the properties where we live. On a typical suburban property, there's more outside space than there is inside space, yet a lot of people just pour resources, whether it's money, usually water, might be chemicals as well, into these outdoor spaces that actually don't do that much for us. So what do our landscapes do for us in exchange for what they require from us? And so what do you want your landscape to do for you? So these are a couple of pictures from my front yard landscape in Pomona. And my partner and I designed this landscape. It's kind of north facing, so part of it's shady part of the year. And it's a relatively medium size, about 1,200 square foot landscape. And we designed it to do a number of things that we'll talk about later. But the big concept would be that it would be sort of like a semi-woodland that would be great habitat for local native songbirds and pollinators and butterflies. And it really is, if you build it, they will come. And so here's a picture. Some of the plants are still growing in. It's a relatively young landscape of a native black phoebe on a perch that we put in, just an old branch. And you can see black phoebes are incredible aerial acrobats. They will catch all sorts of little gnats and bugs. They're just really cool to have around and to see what they do. And they spend a lot of time in our yard. So that's one of the things that we wanted our landscape to do for us. One of the big ideas is that California native and water-wise landscapes, yes, they save water. On average, you're going to be using no more than a third of the water that a lawn takes to have a thriving native or water-wise landscape. You can easily use even less water depending on your design concept and what sort of plantings you want to use and other factors. So I challenge you to think about, what do you want your landscape to do for you? What's your perfect landscape? It's probably different than my front yard landscape. And that's the exciting thing about it, is that it could be whatever you want it to be. California native and waterwise landscapes do so much more for us. They are beautiful. These are some of my favorite native and waterwise plants for local gardens. And the vast majority of these are ones that are only going to want water every 3 weeks to 4 weeks, a good deep soak on the months that it doesn't rain. And like, for example, in my native landscapes, we just got a good storm. I'm not going to be watering for rains again in the next month. That clock is going to start again. So very low water, absolutely beautiful. You can have any kind of look that you want as well. With that beauty, especially if you're working with California native plants, will come habitat. These plants evolve to have unique relationships with creatures that are lovely to have around and need good homes that have suffered from habitat loss. So these aren't creatures that are going to necessarily be undesirable, but mostly we're talking about songbirds, lizards, beneficial insects like butterflies and pollinators. And the vast majority of, for example, native bees, they're non-stinging. They're not like honeybees. They don't have a big hive to protect, and they are things that really need good homes. Even a lot of species that aren't endangered really have suffered large population losses, as so much of the area where they live has been developed, and we truly can provide homes with them. And it's amazing how fast things will show up if we want to embrace that with our gardening. And it doesn't necessarily need to look very wild or overgrown. So a lot of people like that look, and that's awesome. But it can also look a little more traditional, just using the waterwise and especially the California native plants. And so we hear a lot about monarch butterflies, and we truly, among other things, can provide habitat. And in most of Southern California, they'll show up within a year or two at the most, and you'll have breeding monarch butterflies in your backyard. You might get something like this, a hummingbird nest, and get to watch the babies grow up. All sorts of things like that happen all the time in native gardens, while they're using a lot less water and resources than a typical landscape. And all of that together can make our landscapes much more enjoyable places to live and to learn. So whether it's for you personally, which I love, or so that your kids or grandkids, when they are spending time with you, have that experience, it really is something to learn every single year, no matter how long you have a native garden. Always something different and always so much to learn. One of my favorite things, even though I'm really into plants, one of my favorite things about native gardens is they have this amazing rhythm to them throughout the year that's so much more interesting and enjoyable than a typical turf, maybe some roses and a shade tree kind of landscape. With a turf-based landscape, you're doing all of the work you can, and the sign of success is for the thing to look even and green all year long. And so you're doing all of this work to kind of trick something that really doesn't want to be green and even and the same low height all of the time into doing that. And it's takes a lot of work. It's very active in the summer when it's not that fun to be outside in Southern California, and it's not that interesting. And most people don't use most of the surface of their lawn. On the other hand, with the native garden, you're embracing the seasons. You're watching as and if you want to, you can literally have stuff blooming every season of the year. It's not that difficult when you do your plant selection. And so there's always something coming into bloom, or something going out of bloom, or something with a leaf that's changing color because of the seasons, or maybe wildflowers are coming in. And as that's happening, different life is coming to the garden. So different birds will show up at different times of the year. You'll have some that stay around year round. And for example, we always know it's not just fall on the calendar, but truly fall when the white-crowned sparrows arrive in our yard, coming down from the San Gabriel Mountains where they spend the summer, and they winter, and we see them in our yard every day. And then eventually, when it's warm enough, they head back up to the mountains. All of that is just such a richer experience, literally right outside our door. It's great to go hiking, but we don't need to go hiking to have those experiences. It's so neat to have. And especially if you're into seeing all of that life, you see so much of it when you're inside the house looking out when the birds don't realize that there's people around watching them. It's so pleasurable. And so all of that put together gives us a unique sense of place. I like this quote from Lady Bird Johnson, former First Lady. She was one of the first on like the national scale, speaking about built landscapes intentionally using plants native to the areas where those landscapes are. And I like this quote from her. She says, "Native plants give us a sense of where we are in this great land of ours. I want Texas to look like Texas and Vermont to look like Vermont." And I'm quite a bit more cynical than Lady Bird Johnson, but my take on it is it costs a lot to live in California. And if I am lucky enough to live in California and have a small plot of land, whether I own, rent, or it's a community space, I'm involved at a school, whatever it is, there's a small plot of land where I can have input as to what's going to happen there. Why would I want that piece of yard to look like a parched imitation of a typical turf-based East Coast landscape style? And really, it goes even farther back to like a rich European landowner landscape style. That's where the turf style comes from. Doesn't make sense to me. I want to wake up to the natural beauty of California every day and enjoy it when I come home every evening. And so I do, and it's absolutely lovely. And one of the additional bonuses is that the vast majority of the plants are very low maintenance. No garden is no maintenance, but once you kind of get things going and you get the weeds under control, most of these plants only want to be touched at the most once a year for a little bit of cleanup and pruning. Some of them don't even need that. And that time of year when you're going to be most active in the garden is in the spring for some plants and in the fall for other plants for the most part, which means when it's hot in the summer, you don't have to do a lot outside. I love that about native and water-wise gardens. And so if you want, it could be a very naturalistic look. This is a lovely garden, first garden that the homeowner ever did. He designed it and installed it himself. He obviously has the knack for it. Very naturalistic California native front yard garden on a relatively small front yard that's on a side street, but pretty close to a busy street. And so not only is there beauty, is there a sense of place, but also just structurally, the house feels so much more nicely set back a little bit from the street, a little bit away from the traffic, a little bit quieter in the house. And the house is just really transformed by how it feels like it sits on the lot by having this instead of some flat turf. It's really incredible. And if this wild look isn't what you like, it can be more traditional and more formal. So I really also like this garden, not as much personally my style, but it shows this is 80+% California native front yard with some other Mediterranean, very water-wise plants with a much more traditional look. And with all of the clipping to keep this like this look, it's definitely not quite as low maintenance, not quite as much habitat value, but still night and day, more habitat value and much less maintenance than the typical turf and roses kind of landscape. You'll see that some of these pictures are credited to the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour. Quick plug, thank you for them letting us use their images. Theodore Payne Foundation is an incredible nonprofit based in Sun Valley in the San Fernando Valley, and they basically work to promote the use and conservation of California native plants. And not all, but a significant part of what they do is through promoting their use in the urban landscape. They do all sorts of cool classes. The event that I took a lot of the pictures on here that I took is their Native Plant Garden Tour, which happens every spring, 2 days where you can visit homes all over different parts of LA and really see them in person, talk to homeowners about their experiences, sometimes talk to contractors who installed them, and see it for yourself in a real residential setting. So I definitely encourage you to check that out. You can also find on they have a specific separate website for the garden tour. It's nativeplantgardentour.org. And you can see photo archives of many, many different houses in the past on the tour. So if you're getting ideas for what you might want for your landscape, definitely check that out as well. A lot of inspiration. And so that's what's up with that photo credit. And so, yeah, whatever style you like, there's a way to do it and have it be done water-wise. So a lot of people, if this has piqued your interest, might be thinking, where do I start? And so one of the big ideas is you don't start here. You don't start at the nursery, even if it's a really good nursery. This is the native plant nursery at the California Botanic Garden in Claremont. One of my favorite nurseries, great nursery, but you don't start here. The reason why is that if you are thinking of truly a landscape transformation project, something that's more than like finding the right 2 plants for your planter, then there's a lot more that you want to be thinking about before you're thinking about what's the cool plant for that spot. You want to go to a good nursery, and the people there can be very helpful, but you need to know a lot more about what you truly want and are going to benefit from first. Because what happens when you go to the nursery is that this looks really cool, it has a really nice flower in the 1 gallon pot. And so you grab 1 of this and 2 of that and 3 of those and 1 of something else and 1 of something else, and you bring back what caught your eye that day. And then what happens for most people is they realize, well, maybe they got too many plants that really need full sun, but they actually have more part shade where they have, the room for more plants. And some plant that looked really nice in the 1 gallon pot, well, that's actually going to get 12 feet wide. And there's not really a space for a 12-foot wide plant. And so things go in just hoping for the best. Sometimes plants that need more water are mixed with plants that need less water. And you don't really set yourself up for long-term success, both for the maintenance, sometimes for the health of the plant or the beauty of the landscape. And so where I really encourage you to start before you go to the nursery is you want to start with your goals for this space. Whatever those are for you, what the perfect landscape is going to be for you specifically, your space, your yard, how you want to use it. This is a list of goals from probably one of the more challenging sets of residential landscape design clients that I have worked with. And the reason why is that they are my parents. And it's always interesting working on a project with your parents. The dynamic's a little bit different. My dad actually had a very easy set of goals for their project. I don't really care whatever makes your mom happy. My mom had a lot of goals for actually a pretty small backyard. So here was the list. She wanted a comfortable place to sit and read, a place that would feel relaxing, something with the sound of water, so like a water feature to dampen the noise from the neighborhoods, all of the lawnmowers and string trimmers, which they're not going to need in their yard anymore, but are still going on around. Something that would be relatively simple to maintain, something that would hide a less than attractive cinder block wall that goes all the way around the backyard without spending a lot of money on like custom plaster work or something like that. Something that would attract birds, that would look nice, cram in a space to grow a few vegetables, and do that all while making a small garden space feel bigger. And that can be done through the design process that we're going to be talking about. But I don't think it can be done, and I certainly couldn't do it by just hitting the nursery and grabbing what plants catch my eye. So the actual plant selection part comes a bit later on in the process, and we have resources to share with you to help you with that plant selection part. So stay tuned. And just to kind of show you as an introduction how that project went, here is April 2015. We had already killed the turf, taken it out at that point, did this as part of the first round of Southern California turf replacement rebates. Here was plant layout day. So we had our kind of design concept, and it was going to be a water-wise meadow mix of California native and just general water-wise and Mediterranean plants. This is actually a pretty high plant density if you see the number of plants, because with the meadowy concept, we're working with a large number of pretty small plants. And then just using stuff that we had around. So an old bag of flour to kind of chalk out where we think the good walkway is going to be, kind of matching the design concept. I just hit a stake into the ground, wood stake from the hardware store, had this kind of like not very stretchy kind of strapping in the garage, and just pulled it out to a certain measurement and then held it tight when I sprinkled some of that flour. Did that again to make the space. Here was going to be a space for the bench, little step out onto it, and then take a look. And if you think you should move around plants, even if they're going to be different than your design concept, or you actually then get to sit out there and feel, this area needs to be bigger, this is the time to do it. If you draw up a formal design, don't feel like that's exactly what you need to put in. That's just a concept to help you get the right amount of plants into the right place. You can always change things around. Even the best planting designs and landscape architects are going to be switching things around in the field once you get to laying everything out. Here's it planted. This is the point where a lot of people who are doing this for the first time think, oh my gosh, it's just a sea of mulch and there's just a few small plants. I should have spent way more money on plants, got plants that were much larger, got twice as many plants. Occasionally people go out and cram in a bunch more. Don't do that. If you've gone through the design process we're going to talk about, if you do the research to know how big the plants are going to get, putting the right plant in the right place, we're going to talk about all of that. Have some faith. The smaller you put plants in the ground, on average, just what's called a 1 gallon size plant, for the most part. Occasionally, there's a specific reason to plant larger. Occasionally, if you can find the plant smaller, that's okay too, if you're going to make sure that the little tinier root balls don't dry out, but mostly small 1 gallon plants. Have some faith. So this is April 2015. This is October the same year in that backyard. And so you can see the concept. We went with a lot of this small native grass-like plant called Berkeley sedge as kind of the backbone of this planting. To keep it simple, to have a design that holds together in a small space, and then intermixed with that are other ornamental grasses, seasonal flowering plants, other visual accents that hold everything together, and then the careful use of investing in a few really nice planters, one of which we turned into an overflowing fountain, which just recycles, going into a little hidden reservoir that we bought that's buried in the ground, and just a cheap little fountain pump. And so here it is. The sound of water also kind of really makes a visual accent, structural accent in the space. The bench is the place to sit and read with these shrubs that we're pruning up into small trees to start to provide some shade. Here it is looking back at the main house. And so you can see this is really not a very deep space at all, but we're able to fit in all of these small spaces and strategically use the elements to create a slightly different sense of space in them. Farther towards the corner of the yard, here's the one vegetable bed that we had room for, looking back towards an old lemon tree, which was one of the couple of plants we were able to leave in. It really is, if you build it, they will come. So the bird habitat wasn't really even a huge part of it. It was a consideration, but here we have a falcon coming down and taking a drink just because there's a clean circulating water source in the middle of, this is Van Nuys, San Fernando Valley, Southern California. And here you can see seasonal color accents like the Australian kangaroo paws and the South African red hot poker, both Mediterranean climate, water-wise plants. So that's just one example. My perfect backyard for me looks quite a bit different with a different set of goals. And so I encourage you to think about your goals. And then we'll talk about the design process in more detail later on to figure out how to come up with a design that meets your goals. So what are some of the other things that this can look like? Some inspiration. Here's some more Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour pictures. It can be very simple. So, very simple concept, almost an alternative for a front yard. This is that same Berkeley sedge, but just planted closer together and trimmed a little bit more often with some other native grasses, and then a couple of trees, a native sycamore over here, redbud over here, kind of very modern and clean. Within courtyard spaces, we have patio trees like this Desert Museum Palo Verde. And one of the things I love about water-wise gardens and native gardens is that they lend themselves so well to these relatively very inexpensive to put in, but feel great to be in informal patio spaces. And from a sustainability standpoint, a gravel patio space like this or a decomposed granite patio space are also much lower ecological impact than a traditional like pave or brick patio, because when the rain falls water is able to just absorb right into the soil right there. It's not going to run off into the street. You don't have to put in drains usually, and then you have to deal with that if the drain clogs or anything flooding anywhere. The roots of the plants can grow underneath here a little bit, so if it does rain, they can get access to that water. Usually the gravel or decomposed granite comes from relatively close by, and that makes it not only more sustainable ecologically, but also much, much cheaper to put in. And you can have kind of a nice amorphous natural space that just washes directly into the areas where you have your plants. When you see front yard spaces, all of a sudden you see social spaces sometimes cropping up in front yards as well. If you do want formal pavers like you have here, instead of grout or something that's going to seal them up in between, you can have gravel or decomposed granite, which we'll look at later, which will also allow the rainwater to soak in between the stepping stones. Again, here's another picture of that more formal native and water-wise landscape, where I also really like the idea of a kind of modern style, which mixes maybe geometric lines of pavers that has a formal element, but that allows for a very wild look to the landscape that helps things all come together. Or my personal kind of aesthetic, to me, this is kind of a perfect front yard to me, very natural looking, but still you can see very intentional, a nice decomposed granite pathway to walk on, but then just edged with local river rock kind of cobble and a mixture of California native flowering perennials with kind of a meadowy feel. To me, this is a little slice of heaven right here. And so whatever your style, rebates are available to help make it happen if you are in Southern California. And the main website that you are going to look at rebates at is SoCalWatersmart.com. That is a website that is a project or run by the Metropolitan Water District, who is the Southern California water wholesaler that is providing the imported water to eventually, as it gets to your house by your direct water provider. And so they coordinate the regional rebate programs for the rebates that are going to be available across Southern California. Your local water provider may very well have additional conservation programs and really great stuff to look into. So check both of them as well. But for many of the rebates, and especially the turf replacement program, which might be of interest to some of you who might be moving from turf to a water-wise garden, that's where you're going to want to go. It also happens to be where you would get your rebates from water-efficient devices, like if you buy a high-efficiency washing machine or something like that, there are rebates available. So check it out. Check out the programs, SoCalWatersmart.com. And the current rebates that might be of most interest to most people are going to be that turf replacement program, as well as weather-based irrigation controllers, which are the irrigation controller, sometimes called the timer. It's the thing that tells your irrigation system, if you have an irrigation system that has a digital box that tells it when to turn on and off. That's the thing. That's the irrigation controller or irrigation timer. Same thing. And there is a newer generation of them, which will automatically adjust if you set it to based on the weather. Now, this is great for a lot of plants for reasons we're not going to quite get into this, but we cover in some of our other workshops. Not necessarily the setting that you would have for native plants, but still you can use it and just not turn on the weather sensors. You can use a different schedule. So like in my yard, I have one and I use all the weather-based functions to save a lot of water and really provide the exact amount of water I need to my fruit trees and my vegetables. And then I do my native plantings a little bit different. But what I love about it as well is if you are getting a weather-based irrigation controller, which is in range of your home Wi-Fi system, there are many brands, many choices, but it's a much different kind of product than the kind of older generation is, where you're standing usually in the garage, pressing a button over and over again. And it's something that's more complicated to program than an old VCR. The newer generation, there's an interface that you can stand at if you need to, but really everything you do, if it's in range of your home Wi-Fi system, can be done from a computer screen and or a phone app, which makes it much more intuitive, much easier to make adjustments. You can turn things on and off standing out in the yard to make sure you don't have any leaks. So I encourage you to look into that. That's going to be a minimum rebate of $80. Some local areas put in additional. So currently in our local area, it's a $160 rebate. Often won't pay for the entire thing, but will pay for the vast majority of it. And then there's additional rebate. So check the website for details. If you are in our local service area, so if you get your water from Monte Vista Water District, Ontario, Chino Hills, Cucamonga Valley Water District, Fontana, or Upland, you can actually qualify for completely for free having a licensed landscape contractor install one of those smart irrigation controllers or smart timers for you. Basically, with a class that you can do online, you do that first, and then you can get signed up. To get the details for that, you want to contact the conservation staff member at your local water provider. Who that is a little bit different, but you can either check the website. Some of the websites for the water providers have a conservation page where you can find out, or you can just call the customer service number and tell them that you're heard about the irrigation controller installation program and you'd like to be connected to the conservation coordinator to get the details for signing up for that. You do have to have an irrigation system which is in good enough shape that it might be able to save some water to install this. So you need to have previously had some sort of irrigation timer so that there's valves and wires that the timer can connect to. And they'll do a quick audit of your system to make sure you don't have like a bunch of broken pipes. So if they put this thing in, they want to make sure that it can function how it's supposed to and potentially save you some water. You can always make the fixes that you have to, and then they'll come back and then they'll install if that's what needs to be done. And then the big deal is the turf replacement rebate. And so this is a rebate where you will get a rebate per square foot of turf you remove to be replaced with a water-wise garden. And it's per square foot up to 5,000 square feet. And so the key thing with this is that it is to replace turf. The turf doesn't need to be beautiful and green. You could have turned off the water a while ago. It could be quite brown and parched, but it's not just paying you to put in a water-wise garden if you have dirt, if it's new construction, but it's actually to remove grass and put in a water-wise garden so that it's going to potentially save some water. And that is something that you get per square foot of grass coming out and water-wise landscape that meets all the requirements. And we'll talk about the requirements going in. The minimum would be it's at least $2 a square foot. Some areas, the local water agencies are kicking in more to increase the incentive. So within our service area, it's a minimum of $3 a square foot. And for example, Monte Vista Water District customers access even a little bit higher of an incentive at $3.50 per square foot. You can apply for up to 5,000 square feet per fiscal year. So if you have a really large yard, you can split it up. The fiscal year for Metropolitan Water District that provides the rebates is June through July. So for example, you could apply now, do up to 5,000 square feet and apply again next summer, or more likely it'd be better to plant next fall and do that as well. And so those are some basic details, and we're going to get into the additional details. Go to SoCalWatersmart.com. That's where all of the details are. Definitely read those. And so what we're going to be looking at now are, as I've worked with people going through this process, where I see the most questions, the most confusion, some quick tips, but that is not to say that you shouldn't. Also, go to SoCalWatersmart.com, read all of those details. The biggest, most important thing is you cannot begin any work on your project until after you have not only submitted your application, but received back from them official approval for your rebate. So you can't start ripping out your grass, even if you're really excited and you want to, because they actually have an approval process. And part of that, to kind of make sure that the funds are being spent correctly, is that a percentage of the properties actually get audited, meaning they send someone out to make sure, is there in fact turf? Is it the right amount of square feet? That's just from public administration point of view, with public funds going to these sorts of programs, what you're supposed to do. So you can't start doing any work until after you've received approval for your rebate. Some application tips. They're going to ask you for a whole bunch of information. And if you're not ready to finish your rebate yet, you basically create a login, a password, and so you can work on it a little bit at a time. One thing that they're going to ask you is not only the square footage of area that you're asking for the rebate for, but for their program tracking and kind of logistics, you're going to need to tell them your total lot size. So if you don't have that handy, the easiest way to do that is whatever your address is, you can type that into any search engine. So type your address into Google. And the first number of returns on the search engine will usually be a bunch of real estate websites. Even if your house hasn't been for sale in many decades, they just have basically these databases that automatically can generate profiles of every property based on public information. And so where you'll find that information is a little bit different depending on it. But for example, this is the address of our headquarters facility at the Waterwise Community Center. So if you want to come visit our demonstration garden, that's our address. And so if you type that address in, one of the first results that comes is from a real estate website called Zillow. And if you click on the profile, you will see the lot size. Now we have a large commercial property, so it's in acres. For residential property, that's going to give you your square feet. At the time of application, you're going to already have to have decided what areas of turf you will be transforming and how many square feet each of them will be for how many square feet for the front yard, for the side yard, and for the backyard. It can be a combination of all of them, or it might be all just in the front yard. You need to do at least 250 square feet unless your whole landscape is fewer than 250 square feet or less than 250 square feet. The rebate will pay per square foot up to 5,000 square feet. This may or may not cover the entire cost of the project, depending on many factors. We'll talk about cost a little bit later on, but essentially, if you are doing all of the work yourself and just buying landscape and irrigation materials, if you are at that $3 per square foot mark, and even with careful design, if you're at that $2 square foot mark for your rebate amount, you can probably make that kind of even out with the rebate budget. If you are hiring a contractor, in almost all situations, that will pay for part of it, that will offset the cost, but it will not pay for the entire thing. Around here with the $3 per square foot rebates, we are finding that depending on the contractor, depending on the project, that's often covering between 1/3 and 1/4 of the project cost. Some come in lower, some come in higher, but that gives you a general idea of what to estimate. When you are figuring out your square footage for the areas that you are transforming, the best thing to do if it's relatively a square rectangular shape is just to measure by hand with a measuring tape, the length, the width, multiply that together. If you have an odd shaped area, like for example, I live on a cul-de-sac, so my front yard is a strange wedge. If you don't want to do the geometry, break out the old textbooks or the internet tutorials, you can also on Google Maps, the website, maps.google.com, try to use some measuring tools. Most people don't know that these exist, but if you go to Google Maps website and you type in your address and you zoom in as much as you're able to, and then you click on, I believe it's always the lower left, you can get like a satellite image view of it. And then if you right click on the picture, you can get some options and you can select measure. And then it launches this little kind of connect the dots shapes that you can draw. And then if you connect all of those dots, it'll tell you the square footage of the area. And it's pretty accurate. It's in most cases going to be accurate enough. But if it's easy enough to measure, that'll always be the best thing. And then getting through this, one thing that causes a lot of confusion, so we'll talk about it more, is you're going to have to choose what's called a stormwater retention feature, and you're going to have to build that. So essentially what it means is that in addition to having the Waterwise plants, part of what a modern sustainable garden does is when it does rain, when we do finally, after so many dry months, get a storm like we just got recently, your landscape should have something that holds on to at least some of that water that falls onto the property. So usually that's going to be water coming down off of like the roof of a house. Sometimes, depending on how it's built, it's coming off of a driveway or something. You might have roof gutters and a downspout. You might not. Either way, you can build something like this. But essentially, it's something like what you see on the right. There's many different options, but something like a dry stream bed is kind of the most common. They also look quite nice as a feature in the landscape. So a little sunken area that's going to take some water off from the roof. And actually, it's functional. It's sunk down a little bit. It's going to hold on to some of it, let it trickle down, kind of hydrate the garden area a little bit more. And then on a good rain year or over time, eventually help recharge our local groundwater. So no one's specific individual yard is going to solve all of our water resources problem. But if every time a landscape gets a major revision, we put something little in that's going to do that, over time, it will make a difference. And so there's different options. They are a rain garden, a rock garden, a dry riverbed, a swale, berms, rain barrels, or cisterns. So it can also be a physical rain barrel that captures the water, and then you use the water in your landscape later. And we'll talk about some of those. Don't get too caught up on the names. As long as you have something that's going to do the function and you choose the closest thing based on, they have pictures for all of them, you don't need to worry. They're not going to say, well, you chose rain garden instead of rock garden, so it's an issue. It's just a general guide. Really, they're more concerned about the function. And then you also will need to tell them the total of number of plants that are going to be planted as part of the project. The requirement is at least 3 plants per 100 square feet. If you have 100 square feet coming out, for example, 3 plants. So if you're doing a 1,000 square foot garden, you need at least 30 plants. When I do designs of a garden space, usually it's easily over that number just based on designing a nice garden space. So it's not a very hard bar to hit when you are doing your design, but you need to make sure you're going to hit that. Doesn't need to be perfect. I mean, they're not going to come out. You do need to have more than 3 plants per 100 square feet, or a minimum of 3, but they're not going to come out and count plants and say, well, you said that you were going to have 100 plants and you only have 98 plants. As long as you're above that 3 plants per 100 square feet, you're going to be fine. You're also going to need to upload through the website a copy of your recent water bill, a copy of a landscape plan. Don't get intimidated by that. They are very, very lenient with what they approve. They just want to see that you have thought about it some, that you have some ideas. I've seen lots of plans that they've approved. Some of them literally look like they were drawn by a 7-year-old, just the rough shape of the yard. I'm going to have, some native plants over here. Here's where my dry stream bed is going to be. Here's where my shade tree is going to be. Some rough circles don't need to be in the exact right place, and you should be fine. Get as fancy as you want, but don't worry about it. And even from that original, like I mentioned, things are going to slightly evolve. They're not going to come back against your plan and say, you shifted this and shifted that. As long as you meet all of the requirements, really that's what they're going to be concerned about. So you submit all of that. After you get your official approval, which is usually 1 to 2 weeks, just depending on how many people are applying, there's going to be kind of a clock that's going to start. And you're going to have 180 days after your approval to complete the project. After you complete your project, you will take pictures, upload photos of your completed project, and then you can officially request your rebate. They check those photos. They may or may not send someone out to physically check the landscape. Again, that's part of them just doing best practices for running a program like this. If they come, it's not necessarily that they suspect you have done anything wrong. It's random selection. And then you will be able to get your rebate. There'll be some processing time, but then you will get it. One important thing to know is that on your federal income taxes, rebates over $600 will be taxed. So if you get a $2,000 rebate, at the end of the year, you will actually get tax documentation as if you had gotten, if it was a $2,000 rebate, it would be like as if you had received an additional $1,400 of income that year that will be taxable. This is something that they have tried to get exceptions for, but the federal tax law so far has been sort of immovable on that. So it's still a great deal, but if you do your 5,000 square feet and get your $15,000 check, I just really don't want you to be surprised that you will get tax documentation on that as basically additional income at your tax rate. And so with the photos that you are asked to submit as part of the initial one, just quick tip, they don't want close-ups of plants. It's just something to prove that this is in fact your yard, so that get parts of your house, parts of your garage. This is okay. This is still turf. This is my front yard when I was applying for the program. You don't have to water a bunch to have a beautiful green lawn to then apply for the program. If this was all weeds, if this was down to dirt, it would not qualify. But this is turf, which won't be beautiful. But in theory, if I wasn't going to take it out and put in another garden, I could start watering again. Parts of it would green up. And so it's okay if you haven't been watering, if you haven't been taking care of it very well, as long as it's not down to dirt or weeds. Okay, so I only see one question that's come in so far from Helen, who asked in a picture a long time ago, the more enjoyable place to live at the beginning. What is the large shrub or small tree with the blue cone-shaped flowers? That was a ceanothus, sometimes called California lilac, not really a lilac. Ceanothus is the better name. There are many, many different ceanothus. Some are very easy to grow. Some are tricky to grow. If you want a large shrub like that, there are two ceanothus. I'm not sure which one that is exactly because there's many, many different ones. And in a picture like that, it's hard to identify. But the two larger ones, one kind of almost large enough to be a small tree that grows very well in our area, is called Ray Hartman ceanothus. And then one that's a medium-sized shrub with a very dark blue flower that's like a 6 to 9 foot shrub that I really love is called Concha ceanothus. So those are two of the easier ones to grow. Some of the other ones are just pretty fussy with not wanting too much water. Nothing wants too much water, but some of the ceanothus that are very beautiful are a little bit tough for first-time gardeners. Those two are a bit easier. If you're growing them in inland, hot Southern California, like around us, they're best in like morning sun, but then some shade in the afternoon. So like I have one pretty close to the east side of my house, and it loves life there because it's full sun for most of the day, but then it doesn't get that full blasting, really hot afternoon sun. So quick little plant diversion. Very happy to answer those sorts of questions. And let's keep going. But if you have questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A. So what is this? A little bit more about the stormwater retention feature requirement. And it is a requirement for the rebate, but even if you're not doing the rebate, just a great thing to consider, both for the issues that I mentioned earlier. This should just, in 2021 in Southern California, it's just part of doing a landscape retrofit if you have any concern for kind of water sustainability. And we all should, especially if we want to have, even in our low water gardens, we want to have the ability to do any watering in the future. Collectively, we need to think about water resources, and this is a lovely way to do it. And in many cases, if you have drainage issues at your house, if you have any problems, it's a good way. Sometimes those are the areas that naturally accumulate a lot of water. And those are the areas where you can turn a problem that maybe is going to cause damage to your foundation over time into something that's lovely, that's going to let the water soak in the place where you want it. And that was definitely the case at my house, where you can see this picture. This is kind of in process. You can see we're still kind of starting to work with larger rocks. Doesn't all need to be done at the same time. If it's a DIY project, we got the basic kind of dip in the landscape in the right place in, the gravel in, and then we're going back over time and bringing in some larger rocks when we had them and making it look a little bit more natural. My house is on a bit of a slope from the street, not extreme, but enough that water, especially when it comes off of the roof, because we don't have roof gutters, would just kind of flood this area. So we turned this into the beginning of a loose dry stream bed to capture that water coming off the roof. And if in a big storm, anything trickles through the mulch to get that as well, and not have it sitting right at the base of the house, which is what it used to do. So a rain barrel is technically an option to meet the stormwater retention feature if you want, if you're into rain barrels. But as part of that requirement, you need to have gutters all the way around your house, and you are going to have to cut and modify how your downspouts from your rain gutter system comes down to get into your rain barrel. And just to kind of put it into perspective, so the average rain barrel is 50 to 60 gallons, occasionally a little bit larger. When it does rain, that could fill up in a matter of minutes. So picture on 1,000 square feet of roof area, a 1-inch rain event will create over 620 gallons of water. So that little 50-gallon thing is going to be like nothing. So in the last rain event, we had something like 3 inches of water over those last couple of days when we finally got a good storm. So you're talking like over 1,800 gallons of water. So that little 50-gallon rain barrel, that's like nothing. And then even in our water-wise landscapes where we're only watering once a month, when it does finally come time to water that native, very low water-wise landscape, to take a 1,000 square foot landscape and apply 1 inch of water, like the equivalent of like it rained 1 inch to it, which is normally what's done when a native landscape is watered. You apply, whether it's drip or sprinklers, about the equivalent of 1 inch raining on it. Again, that's going to require 620 gallons of water, which is actually quite reasonable. Most of us just have no clue how much water we're actually using in our houses. And so again, that 50 gallons of water is not going to do much. And so some people are really into having their rain barrels. And if that's you, if that's kind of part of like your hobby and how you want to work with your landscape and your house, go for it. But for the average person, those rain barrels are really not good for that much more than filling up a watering can and then hand watering some like potted plants on the patio. Another thing to think about is that what's in that rain barrel, it's very hard to get that into an irrigation system. Not what most people are going to do at home. And so how do you then use that water? And then the final thing about rain barrels to think about is that rain barrels need to be perfectly screened where the water goes in. Because if they are not, and if that screening isn't checked and maintained, that's 50 gallons of mosquito habitat sitting right outside your front door, which neither you or your neighbors want. So if you're into it, do it by all means. But for most people, that's not your best solution. Just as an example, in that last rain event where we had 3 inches of rain and off the front side of my house probably had 1,500 gallons of water come down. My system of just passive dry stream bed and a couple other things I'm going to show absorbed all of the water into the garden. So that's going to be much more effective for most of us than a rain barrel type system. And so here's where things kind of start, where water comes off of my roof and has a little chance to soak in. But also there's not a lot of space here. And as things go farther down, so the picture was kind of in this area just off the screen, as it gets closer to the front of the house, there's not even room to really have that wider, even though it's not that wide, dry stream bed, because it's right along the walk. And I didn't want to dig that right next to the walk, both because it would look funny, but also I wouldn't want anyone visiting to like roll their ankle kind of right down into a ditch. And so instead of that, it transforms into something called a French drain, which is not listed formally as one of the options, but you could just call it a dry stream bed. It's fine. I've done it on many designs and guided many people through it. It gets approved because it does the function. And so what that is basically is it's just a trench. It's about a foot wide, about a foot deep along this walkway, and then filled with a kind of large size gravel. It's 1.5 to 3 inch gravel, so much bigger than pea gravel, but available from local landscape supply yards. And so when the water comes off the roof here, instead of flooding this whole area like it used to, it goes into this trench, which, because we have the large size gravel in there, the water kind of soaks into all of those pore spaces in between the gravel. And the bottom of that trench just follows the slight slope of this walkway. And so when there's enough rain, and a small rain event is just going to get absorbed in place, but when there's enough rain, the water in this trench will slowly move in this direction. We dug underneath the path in just one area, which usually, as long as your pathway isn't all cracking, you can totally do. Put a small, just empty pipe underneath and allow that water to go off to the side, where along the side of the driveway, as you can see in this picture, we kind of continued that. So water also that would be washing off of our driveway that used to flood this area also goes into that French drain and then into the backyard, where it can go into a wider dry stream bed if it's a really big rain event. And that only happens lately, only every couple of years. Finally, we had a storm event that was large enough to do that just recently. But that also then takes in all of the water coming off the other side of the house and is a little bit wider. One key thing is, however you do it, dry stream bed, French drain, something else, you don't necessarily need to fill it with gravel. It could just be a depression with some plants that can take occasional flooding, and there's some options with that. However you do it, if you have the room, you're going to want to find a space in your yard to sink that precious rainwater in that's at least 10 feet from your building foundations. That's the best practice. Now, it depends on your building, depends on the soil, depends on your space. There are plenty of houses that have, like, for example, this house has probably had a flooding problem up against the foundation since it was built, just based on the landscape. So probably 60 years until I installed this, and the foundation's in great shape, but we have soil that lets the water soak right in. Still, I want this house to be around for many, many more years. So, I'm going to try to let that get farther away. So at a small rain event, you can see we didn't really have the ability to set it up to be more than 10 feet away. And that's okay. But for our overflows, we made sure that it starts to get a little bit farther away from the house if it's a big, big rain event. And so this, as it opens up into the backyard, is part of my backyard when the plants were young, not grown in yet. And today you see a lot less of this open gravel and rock area because we've planted more plants and they've grown in, and it really feels like part of the garden space. And so how this is going to work for you doesn't need to be rocket science. It's about looking at your yard. Where does your water come from? Is it coming off the roof? Is it washing off of driveways? I rented one place where the upslope neighbor concreted their whole backyard and all the water washed into our yard when it rained. And so we built a series of swales. So like a dry stream bed, except it was just soil with some plants in the bottom that could take that water, and it absorbed all that water coming off of our neighbors. When it rained even a little bit, our garden got a great soaking. So we turned that problem that was causing erosion into a great resource. How much water is it? Is it just a little trickle of water, or is it really causing flooding or erosion problems? How does it move through the property, and where does it already end up? So, for example, I've worked on turf removal projects with people where in the lawn in the backyard, there already is kind of a low spot where all the water that comes off of the house and the roof drains already ends up in that low spot. And so what we needed to do wasn't any huge different kind of projects, but when the turf came out, we just accentuated the pathway that the water took from the roof drain. And then the final settling spot, we just dug it out a little bit more and then designed, the idea that there would be some rocks and gravel going in, but where the water goes didn't need to be altered. Where, like what I showed you from my front yard, we really did need to alter where the water was going to flow because it was causing problems of where it was naturally ending up. I really like this example from a Pasadena front yard. This was designed and built by Scrub J Studios. It's a contractor that's very active in the San Gabriel Valley, seen on the Theodore Payne Foundation tour. So this, again, is another narrow side yard. This is a slightly wider French drain where you can see the downspout here. And the idea of what's said when you're thinking about rainwater on your property these days is you want to slow it down, let it spread out, and then let that sink in. And so slowing it down is about dissipating that velocity, that water, whether it's washing off of a driveway, coming down off of your roof, it's going to be moving pretty fast. And if it's especially hitting soil or even wood chip mulch, it might wash that away some. So here just hits this piece of concrete that's tilted to bring water that way. It might land right into gravel is another way you can do it. And then it goes into this French drain. I really love the use of recycled old terracotta roofing tiles to kind of also mix up the aesthetics of the edging. And here too, young planting. So eventually there'll be more plants and you'll see kind of more glimpses of it than looking directly at all this gravel. You can see here, again, going under the walkway over here. And you can see that this basement before this went in used to sometimes flood, but now things have been changed to where the water is not going to be in any danger of flooding into this basement. And then eventually underneath the walkway, round out into the front. And this actually starts, I'm not showing all of the pictures, this system starts all the way in the backyard, which is a little bit more uphill, which would wash water towards the house. So it captures all of that. In a small rain event, again, soaks it in. And in a large rain event, brings it safely around to the front of the house for this final kind of semi-dry stream bed, or also sometimes called an infiltration basin, if it's just kind of a final spot where things can sink in. And in a really large rain event, if the capacity of this is not enough, then it will just safely overflow through this mulched front yard. The landscape will absorb a lot of that water. And then if it needs to, it can go out to the gutter where it'll be cleaner, there'll be much less of it, and it can go out to the storm drain system. Unlikely to happen, but if it should overflow, you always want to have it go kind of somewhere safe where you would want the water to go anyways. And this aesthetic of this very wild, kind of wildflower meadow may or may not be your thing. I think it's quite lovely. But even in a much formal garden, all of the methods for capturing this rainwater can work. Here's just some other kind of pictures. A couple of tips if you're going to be doing this yourself, or even hiring a contractor to do it, because not all contractors, your contractor may very well be able to physically do the work, but might not be used to doing this kind of from a visual or design standpoint. I always recommend people to just work with the local stone native to where you are. So in most of Southern California, where we are, kind of general Los Angeles, San Bernardino County valleys, that's going to be kind of like this range of river rock kind of stone, and some white, some dark grays, some will be striped, some will be speckled. So for us, that's really a beautiful range of rock is naturally what you get. But there's a couple of reasons, three main reasons why I really encourage that. The first one, it's going to be cheaper. The local materials in our area at our local yards you pay by the pound when you buy this stuff, whether it's gravel or rock. The local materials are about a third of the cost of the more imported, fancier stones and quote ornamental gravels. I think this stuff looks nicer anyways, but cost is one. Next one is just kind of environmental issues. The other stuff that comes from far away, that stuff is all coming in on diesel trucks, and there's only so much stone you could fit on a truck. And so there's actually quite a lot of environmental impact from moving that stuff around. Where our local stuff comes from relatively local. A lot of our gravels come from very close by, and a lot of even the bigger boulders come from the very local mountains areas where there's sometimes these storm control or detention areas, and when boulders come washing out of the mountains and where they get caught so that they don't wash into the foothill neighborhoods, those get pulled out and eventually sold to people for landscape rock. So use the local stuff, less environmental impact. And then finally, and visually very important as well, is the local material normally is the material where you're going to be able to access multiple sizes of the material. So a lot of the quote ornamental gravels, you can only get a certain size, like it's all 1/2 inch, it's all 3/4 of an inch. And if you're just doing like a little bit of gravel to put on the top of the soil surface in a succulent that's in a pot, then whatever. But once you bring it up to the scale of a landscape feature, if you only have one size of material, it just doesn't look very good. And so you can get a beautiful kind of naturalistic look by mixing multiple different sizes, which is key to having a really nice look. And you can do that with the local material. Here's another picture. So to me, like this is kind of as naturalistic and beautiful as it gets. This is a little bit more utilitarian, still a nice mix of different sizes, but because it's so narrow here, they had a little bit of retention to do. And so working with larger rocks at the edge to retain that. And then just because it's so narrow, then it kind of drops down some. with still a mixture of different gravel sizes. And so this is a setup that's also typical. If you have a down slope kind of from the street, detached garage and a long driveway, you get a lot of water washing towards the garage. And sometimes things shift over time and that water floods the garage. So you can set it up to make sure that the water goes off to the side. And then if needed to overflow, can go out into the garden area. I teach a full 3-hour workshop called Rainwater Harvesting for Home Landscapes, where we look at these examples, but many, many more, kind of go through the whole design process, show many more examples, tips about how to actually build these things. And so if you're actually going to do this yourself, I really encourage you to check it out. If you want to be able to ask questions, I encourage you to sign up for in early January. I think it's the 8th. I'm going to be teaching it on a Saturday morning from 9 to noon in an online workshop format like this. So you'll be able to ask questions. Also, from the last time I taught it, we have it recorded on our YouTube channel. If you don't want to wait, that's the Rainwater Harvesting for Home Landscapes workshop. So definitely check that out. It's about as much as we can talk about now because we have about an hour left and a lot more ground to cover. And so now we're finally going to talk about choosing plants. And here's the reason why we're talking about it now. So you've thought about your goals for the landscape. Maybe you've thought you want a patio space, you want a place to grill. You thought about where you're going to put your rainwater capture. Oftentimes, because that relies partially on where that water is coming from, you have fewer choices in terms of how to set up your rainwater capture than you do about, where to put your small tree or where to put, whatever shrub you're interested in. And so once you start to understand that, it should become a little bit less intimidating to think about choosing plants, because instead of just a big blank slate of a yard, you might start to envision, well, my patio is going to be over there. So I'm going to want a tree to shade my patio space. That's going to be where, at least we'll have a medium-sized tree. And so next to that, between that and the fence, maybe you have room for one layer of shrubs and then some smaller flowering plants, right at the base of the patio. The space starts to build itself just a little bit. If you look at either online or join us in person for any of our really design-focused workshops where all we talk about is design, we talk about that whole thought process a lot more. We'll talk about it a little bit more as we go on into our design example. But for choosing plants, I encourage you not to be intimidated. You're going to do some research, and this should be a fun research process. Most people, if they're interested in plants at all, as they do the research, are going to fall in love with a bunch of plants. This is when I encourage you to remember to keep it a little bit simple, maybe even simpler than you think you might want. Usually that ends up really helping people out, especially if they're first-time gardeners or doing this sort of thing for the first time. The key kind of first-timer mistake to avoid is don't buy and put in too many plants and crowd them. So if you fall in love with 72 different plants, unless you're an experienced gardener, don't put 72 different plants into your yard. For the vast majority of people, for the average kind of small, medium, or even pretty large size front yard, what I find is that when I just do a nice design that's going to meet the needs and be maintainable for people, we are talking about somewhere between 8 to 20 different plant types total. So different species or varieties of plants. So that might be 1 or 2 species of trees, a few species of shrubs, a few species of smaller plants, maybe a couple of ornamental grasses or something like that. Generally no more than 20. And if you want to do a nice kind of minimalistic but lovely landscape with 5 different plants, you can definitely make that happen if you select them very carefully. And when you're selecting your plants, the key is for success, you want to match your plants to your soil and your site conditions. And so something that is a common term that you hear is right plant in the right place. You want to select the right plant for the right place. And that's going to be doing a lot of the work for having success with plants with you. I 100% do not believe that there is any inherent real difference between people who are good at growing plants and not. So some people say, oh, all my plants die. I'm just not good at it. I don't have a green thumb. I always ask those people because I'm very interested in why that is. When you buy a plant, before you buy that plant, do just a little bit of research. What sort of conditions does that plant want? Does it want sun? Does it want part shade? Does it want shade? Does it need good drainage? Does your soil have good drainage? How big is it going to get? Are you putting it in a space that matches the size that it's going to get over time? Do you look up whether or not it needs any annual kind of cleanup or pruning? Do you do that to keep it looking good? Invariably, people who think they're just bad with plants don't do that. And people who are good with plants, that's what they do. That's the process. And so that's part of why I say don't get 72 different kinds of plants. Even if those 72 different kinds of plants are all low maintenance plants individually, that's a lot of information to look up and to try to remember. Even if you print it all out, that becomes quite a bit to manage. If it's 12 different kinds of plants, that's much more manageable. You can kind of look it up, print out that information from this resource I'm about to show you, put in a little binder. That's your guide. Make a note, here's the plants that are going to want some cleanup in the fall. Here's the plants that are going to want some cleanup in the spring. Make sure that they all want the same amount of water, irrigation frequency. You're going to be good to go. So that's right plant, right place. If you're wondering what well-drained soil is, essentially, if you have heavy clay soil or very compact soil, it's probably not well-drained. Occasionally, people with clay soil do have well-drained clay soil. So I'm not going to get into it fully tonight because it takes a few minutes to explain, even though it's relatively simple. And we go through it in other more specific workshops. But you can do with just a shovel. You don't need to buy anything else other than a shovel. Dig a 1 foot by 1 foot hole a couple places in your garden. With a hose and the timer on your phone, you can do some simple drainage tests. There's different information out there on the internet about it. Some of the methods are not good that you read. I really encourage you to use how we lay it out. So the easiest thing to do is check out on our YouTube page, cbwcd.youtube. Again, that's at the top of the chat. Check out our Choosing, Purchasing, and Planting Water-Wise in California Native Plants workshop. Awesome to watch the whole thing if you want, but if you want to get right to that drainage test and understand if you have well-drained soil or not, 12 minutes in, that's when we walk you step by step, show pictures of what we mean by a drainage test, how to get your results, and based on those results, know whether or not you have well-drained soil. If you don't have well-drained soil, not the end of the world. There are a significant number of water-wise and native plants that want well-drained soil, but there are plenty of choices that can tolerate clay or not perfectly well-drained soil. And on the resource I'm about to show you, it's as simple as clicking that you have clay or not well-drained soil, and it will only give you plant recommendations for the soil that you have. So, top resources to help with plant choices. These are not the only resources, but if you're in our local area, or even if you're kind of anywhere in Southern California, even if you're in a more coastal area, our Inland Valley Garden Planner website, which I will show you in just a second, is what we developed with detailed information about the top 350 plants for local, especially residential gardens, although great choices for commercial gardens, parks, and things like that, if that happens to be something you're involved with, but really focused on the home gardener. And what are the plants that, one, you're likely to be able to find in a local nursery? You might need to go to specialty nursery. We have that list that we can share with you as well. But you have a chance of finding it pretty reliably, pretty easy to grow, and are our top recommendations. There's lots of other good plants, but this kind of just makes it simple and plenty to choose from. I also have a whole workshop where I just plant by plant, what are my favorite plants, and kind of by category. So if you have full blasting oppressive inland heat sun, what are the plants that are going to do well in that area? For that weird spot on the north side of a house or a garage where it's shady a lot of the year, but then when the sun is really high overhead in the summer, it's full blasting sun. That's kind of a tricky place to choose plants for. Walk you through what are my favorite choices for that. And then for those of you in our local area, I'll talk to you a little bit about our residential design assistance program in just a second. But first, I want to show the Inland Valley Garden Planner. And so that's just at inlandvalleygardenplanner.org. And that will bring you here. I encourage you to check out the whole site. There's a lot of stuff there. I'm just going to show you, and we're going to be adding in the new year a bunch of other stuff as well. But I just want to show you the two kind of main sections of it. The first one is what we call our plant finder. If you already know a plant you're interested in, you can search for it by name and have it come up if we have a profile for it. But for most people, if you're kind of thinking, okay, now I know that for this area, I need a shrub. I'm interested in it being California native. It's going to be low water. Most of them are. And it's a full sun area. And in addition to that, so that already gets you from 350 plants down to our top 52. When you can look at the pictures, you can see the basics, height and width. There's a range of different sizes, so you can know if maybe it's going to work. But then you can go even farther. So say, hey, I'm interested in those that attract butterflies. Well, now you're down to 17 plants and very different looks. And then to learn more about them, you can. So someone was asking about ceanothus earlier, mentioned Concha ceanothus. So here we go. That's the profile. And you can see pictures of the plants from further away, from closer up. Some of them, these things are showstoppers in the spring. So that's when all of the pictures we currently have are. It's an attractive shrub that's just this nice green glossy leaves the rest of the year. Some of them you'll see it when it's in flower. Some of them, if they get berries or something, you'll see it then. And you can look at these larger, go through them. You get a full description, the plant properties, so figuring out right plant, right place. So for example, this is one that does grow fine in clay soil. And there is one of those checks, I just didn't mention it, that says clay soil. So it'll only return things that have a pretty good chance of growing in clay soil. Water needs. So there's different water schedules. And in some of our other classes, we go deep into, what does this mean? What does this water schedule mean? There's also information here because it's not always that intuitive. And then also for all of them, even if they're low maintenance, you need to know when to do that. So for example, ceanothus, if you're going to do a little bit of pruning, which can help it stay really nice and compact looking, even as a larger shrub. So a little bit of pruning each year. You don't absolutely have to, but it can be done. But for example, on ceanothus, it's important to do that in the spring or early summer after it's done flowering. If you do it this time of year, you're going to cut off all of the developing buds and you'll get no flowers the next year. So we give you all of those tips for each plant in that maintenance section. So that's the plant finder. The other section we have is about garden design. So if this is all feeling still kind of intimidating for you to select kind of individual plants, some people, they're going to be super into it. Some people, maybe not. We have developed garden design templates for, after working with people, what we've found are the top 8 different kinds of garden themes that people in our area currently seem to be interested in. A lot of them are California native plants. Some of them are mixes. Some of them are like a Mediterranean style garden, so water-wise, but not native plants. One of the really popular ones is a butterfly and songbird garden. So for each of these, you can click on it and then explore the design. And what we have done is we have created example designs and planting plans. So you get a quick description using the same group of plants around a theme. Most of them have 13 to 15 maybe different plants total, 1 or 2 trees, a few shrubs that will grow in different conditions and have different looks. Some of them more structural, some of them really flowery. The ones that have succulents have some succulents. Some smaller perennial flowering plants, things that stay smaller and are great like along pathways where it's not going to get overgrown, maybe an ornamental grass. And so a lot of people might then want to use the plant finder and add in, some additional plants. But this is, you can have a lovely garden with not even all of these different ones. A great, simple start. And with that same kind of selection of plants along a theme, so here, the songbird and butterfly theme, we created designs for extra large, large, and medium-sized gardens with different ways to visualize it, kind of just the look. So this is a patio space and part of the extra large garden with some labels. We are currently working on finishing this interactive version where, there's something that shifted that needs to be refixed. Glad I checked that. We had an update recently. It's getting cut off. And so you can see some of them have versions where it pops up and you can click on it and it will automatically take you to the profile. And in addition to these visualizations, which kind of show you the look, some people might like the look but want less plant density. That's cool. Go for it. Make it your own. And all of these have then also a version of it that's the bird's eye view plan, which exactly matches the visualization. So if you like a look, you can see this. And actually, if you print these off on 11 by 17 paper, they will scale to where 1/8 of an inch is 1 foot, and you can literally measure. But you can also kind of eyeball it, because we give you a key to, if it was in the real world, the size that we were assuming each plant would get. And you can kind of see the spacing in between and how we combine different plants. So maybe you have a small yard, but you like the idea of this plant combination. You can kind of see the spacing that we would recommend to create that plant combination. You might like this kind of hedge idea. And so you can see that. Or if you have a medium-sized yard, here's how that might go into a medium-sized yard with all of the same different kinds of approaches. And so then there's also descriptions. There's a watering kind of recommendation schedule for kind of this whole grouping of plants and other stuff there. So that's basically the Inland Valley Garden Planner. We have lots of other projects in the work to bring even more information and resources to it. So definitely both check back and sign up for our newsletter, because we always announce all of the new stuff that goes into it. And then the last thing that I will mention for now is, if you are within our local service area, you can qualify for our no-cost residential landscape design assistance program, where you will work with our staff, and we will create for you a full scaled plan of either a front yard or a backyard landscape. And we're happy to do both. You just have to, we only do one at a time. So if you do your front yard and you finish your front yard, you can apply again and we can design your backyard for you. There's a lot of information about that. We want you to know exactly what you get. It's as a no-cost program. It's not in-depth as if you hired a landscape architect to work with you for months to come up with all of the tiny details, but it is a full scaled, reliable planting plan that you can either use to create yourself or to hand to a contractor to get different bids and have them build it. About half the people we work with do it themselves, and half the people we work with have a contractor build it. And you can also use that as the design to upload for your turf replacement rebate application. It's no cost, but we do require a $100 fully refundable deposit. If after getting your design, you put a WaterWise garden into the space, you're free to make some changes. But if you put a WaterWise garden into the space within a full calendar year, so we allow you more time than the rebate, we are very happy and always hope to give you that refundable deposit back. It's just a placeholder to make sure you're serious about the program. You choose one of those 8 design styles as a starting point. We always customize it, but we find that that gives us a really good starting point for the conversation. You'll send us, we'll walk you through this, but you'll send us measurements of your yard, photos of your site, and then we'll create a base plan. And right now we're doing it over Zoom. We have an online screen sharing meeting, and we get through most of your yard design. And then afterwards, we kind of finish up all the details. So the full details for that are at cbwcd.org/design assistance. And so wcd.org/design assistance. For those of you who are within our local service area, unfortunately, because basically it's subsidized with our budget, which comes from a tiny sliver of 1% of local property taxes, we are only able to offer this to people who get their water from these water agencies. And so here's an example of a California native front yard garden with a little patio space and a dry stream bed to capture water from the roof that we designed and was later installed as a combination with a contractor doing some of the work and them doing some of the planting themselves in Chino Hills. Just one example. So from Jorge, Covina is not within the area. So yeah, we are a pretty unique program. I do not believe that there's a similar program in Covina, but take a look at all the stuff on the Inland Valley Garden Planner. And although it's different, I will mention now, I mention it later as well, that we are very close to launching, I'm hoping by the end of January, an in-depth series. It's going to be, I think, 11 videos by the time everything is done, many hours of content, step by step, walking you through how to use the Inland Valley Garden Planner to create your own design to scale on graph paper to get kind of a similar result. And it is something that if you are willing to kind of go through the process, watch that series of videos, many people I think are capable of doing themselves, and then you'll get an awesome sense of satisfaction for having design your own yard. Another question came in for Moreno Valley. I do not believe that there's a program for Moreno Valley. So hopefully you can come and take our other classes as well, visit the Waterwise Community Center and use those online resources. So design is part of it. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some more of these concepts. And then one of the big things we're going to do is we're going to pull it all together. I'm going to show you an example of how I did the design for my front yard to kind of bring all of these ideas together. So another thing to think about, lots to think about. That's why I said this is going to be kind of your crash course, and then you don't need to absorb it all. That's why we have the recordings. But these are all the things that you should be thinking about. Sometimes people don't, so that's why we put this together. Construction planning. The biggest thing is make sure you consider it. I've definitely talked to people that got all excited about plants. They went and bought a bunch of plants and they realized that they are nowhere near close to being ready to plant. And then they're watering all of these plants every day that are in the tiny nursery pots. They're getting overgrown and stuff like that. You generally want to buy your plants like right before you're ready to plant, pretty much get them right in the ground after you're ready. That is going to be how you'll be most successful, have the healthiest plants and not spend a bunch of time trying to nurse these things that are not ready going into the ground yet. Biggest thing, make sure you consider it. Are you going to do it all at once? Are you going to do it in phases? Or are you going to do it a bit at a time when you find the time? And whether that's working with a contractor and maybe doing it in phases because of budgetary reasons, that's just fine. Or like for me, I do it all myself. I love doing that, but you know, it's pretty much honestly never done. I'm always tweaking something, changing something, and I still have a pile of rocks next to my dry stream bed, which is fully functional, but I still want to make it look a little bit more natural. And I built the main thing like 3 years ago. So it's just whatever style is going to work for you, but think it out, know what you're getting into. Plan to plant in the best season, if possible. And many people are often surprised to find out that in Southern California, as well as in many hot climates that don't get super freezing cold in the winter, get some frost, but it's not a cold climate by any means. Mid to late fall is the best time to plant, actually. Think basically Thanksgiving through New Year's is really kind of the sweet spot, because even in the spring might be nice, but it's close enough to June where we could be 105 degrees that those plants aren't going to really be ready for that yet. And so when you plant mid to late fall, or very early winter, and definitely, if at all possible, by the end of March. But mid to late fall is the best if you can set everything up. What's going to happen is some plants are going to start growing right away. Some plants, you are not going to see a lot of growth on the top, but those roots are going to be getting settled in. They're going to be starting to do things underground. And then when we get the heat of kind of mid-spring, the following year, so you're planting in November, December, and then you're hitting March, April, those plants are really going to be ready to grow, but they're going to be well rooted in. So if we get our early heat waves, they're going to be deal with it a lot better, and it's really going to be a lot easier to keep everything happy the first year. The first year is always what's called the establishment period. And even really water-wise plants usually are going to want a good deep soak about once a week the first year. Just a general guide. If you have really heavy soil, sometimes it can be less if it's not full sun, but usually about once a week the first year. But if you plant and then it's 105 degrees the next week, then it might need more water, but maybe you're going to be overwatering, and there's just a lot more guesswork. It can be done, but first timers especially, or if you just want the best results, mid to late fall is really going to follow the cycle that's going to be best for the health and establishment of the plants. Summer is a great time for contemplating design. We're going to talk just a little bit, and I'll connect you with more resources about killing turf. It's the best time for killing turf. You can prepare your irrigation. think about your budget going into it. Be realistic about it. And a small budget doesn't necessarily mean a compromised project. In fact, some of the funnest and most creative projects are ones where you have a really small budget, you're scavenging parts, you're doing it a little bit at a time. Totally cool. And then just think about your budget and adjust your design and your phasing as necessary. And if you are working with a contractor, bring them in early. Good contractors are often busy. Sometimes they're booked out for months. So especially if you're trying to hit that sweet spot of when to plant, bring them in early, get costs. And when you select the contractor you're going to work with, get on their schedule. Now, I will say, because contractors are going to be working year round, if you can get lined up to plant mid to late fall, that's definitely the best. There are some really good contractors who really know what they're doing with water-wise landscaping that are going to be installing right through the summer, but they really know what they're doing. And if that's the case for you, ask about some sort of guarantee. Some contractors who really know what they're doing will, basically guarantee these plants are going to live. And if they don't, we'll come back in the fall and we will replace the ones that don't. So that's something that you can ask about. And maybe some contractors will offer that and some won't. And that can kind of help guide you into who the contractor that's going to be the best for you is going to be. Quick note about hiring contractors. When you are hiring a landscape contractor, that is, hopefully you realize by now, and we haven't even started talking about turf removal or irrigation, a skilled set of work. There are lots of landscapers who are just a guy in a truck. And because people think that landscape is manual labor, they will provide manual labor. And some of those people work really hard, but they don't necessarily have the skill set to renovate a whole front yard or a whole backyard. Doing a whole front yard or a whole backyard with irrigation, that should be no different to you than if you are hiring a contractor to redo your electricity or remove a wall in your house, where hopefully you're not just going to hire the cheapest person who claims that they can do the work. So when you're working with a landscape contractor, or going to be, try to get 3 people out to your site to give you quotes on the job. There might be a wide range of prices. The lowest one is not automatically the best. If go with the one that you can afford, that gives you kind of the best feeling that they're going to be right for your needs in general. And always ask for and check references. Generally, I tell people, ask the contractor for 3 references of people that they've done similar size projects on. So if you're doing a whole front yard water-wise garden renovation, you don't necessarily want references unless you're intentionally working with a student and kind of, building their experience. You don't really want just they've done, a flower bed for this person, or they've mowed this person's lawn for the last 2 years. You want similar sized and similar kinds of projects. And then call those people and ask, not only are they happy with the project, but did the costs come in where the original bid from the contractor was? Did the contractor show up on time when they said they would show up? Did they clean up well at the end of the day, and especially at the end of the projects? Were there any hiccups that you think should have been avoided? Make sure that you get kind of good responses from them. Some contractors will be on Yelp, but there's a lot of really good landscape contractors that don't have much of a presence on Yelp. So, look that up. And then finally, California contractor law is that any project, and this is whether it's a landscape contractor, electrical contractor, building contractor, any project that is over $500 of materials and labor combined is legally supposed to be done by a licensed contractor. And what does that mean for you? What's the difference? Well, a licensed contractor has had to pass a test, which doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be great. Minimum baseline. But to have a contractor's license, they need to hold insurance and workman's comp for their crew, which means if somebody gets injured when they are working on your house, that is going to be covered and taken care of by the contractor's insurance and workman's comp, and you are protected. If you're just hiring some guy with a truck and something does happen to go wrong, on your property and they're not a contractor, that gets much more complicated. If they are a contractor or represent themselves as a contractor, ask for their contractor's license number. And then what you can do is you can go to the state contractors license board. And if you just put, check California state contractor license into Google, just whatever, you'll come up with it. And there's a quick search form where you can put in their contractor number, and it will tell you if they are still in good standing and kind of information to make sure about that. So that's generally working with a contractor. Cheapest is not always the best. Sometimes the cheapest person doesn't know how to budget a job right, and they might be coming back to you asking for a little bit more money halfway through the project. Whereas the people who really specialize in this kind of work and do some of the best work that I've seen, they are going to come in higher because they are getting compensated for their specialty knowledge, the quality that they bring, and the fact that they have crews that generally get paid more and have more experience as well. And so that's something that they're being compensated for. So it's all about kind of the relationship, the feel you get, and the recommendations in their portfolio that they bring. So what should you expect in terms of cost? It's going to be different based on your local area, based on who you talk to. But from the people who we've worked with for the landscape design assistance program that I mentioned, who then go on to hire contractors or do it themselves, here's what we find. If you're doing a DIY project, that's basically you're removing your turf yourself, you're planting, you are buying the parts to do irrigation, which might end up costing more than your plants. Irrigation supplies are not super cheap. And then like bringing in some mulch or some gravel, nothing extravagant, but still enough to do a really nice project. If you're doing the work yourself or with friends and family, you can often do that within that $3 per square foot budget, especially if you kind of set out for that to be the intent. You don't need to buy huge, large trees. Even in my front yard, all of my trees I planted were 1 gallon plants. If you're working with contractors, if like the average project that we work on with people, they're not changing any concrete walkways. They're not necessarily building a new patio or a huge shade structure. Their primary, especially for a front yard, doing turf removal, maybe some shrubs coming out that are existing that are going to be redone, and then putting in plants, adapting an existing irrigation system, either converting it to drip irrigation, maybe altering the spray irrigation to make it better, adding mulch, and then like the modest water capture feature to meet the requirements. We're seeing $7 to $9 plus a square foot, maybe $9 being kind of pretty average per square foot. So, that's maybe the rebate's covering about a third of the cost. Definitely a range. Occasionally you find cheaper, but I wouldn't say assume that you're going to find cheaper. If you're doing all of the above, plus demolishing a pathway or doing some like flagstone paths, some slightly larger ornamental boulders, maybe some landscape lighting, new gravel or decomposed granite paths, or things like that as well. $12, $13 a square foot and kind of up would be what to consider. And kind of like working with those more kind of specialty contractors and including things like that, definitely you're going to be up in that range. So that's just kind of a general guide. All of this depends on many factors, includes access, slope, front yard, backyard. So your costs will not necessarily match these exactly, and definitely get multiple quotes. So what we're going to do from here is we're going to very quickly go through bringing it all together in a design, just so you can see the process. And then we're going to spend our last bit of time going through the introduction to turf removal, a little bit about irrigation, and then plenty of time for questions at the end. If there are more questions, I'm happy to stay until after 8:30 and try to answer as many as I can. I'm going to get a quick sip of water. So bringing it together in a design. Here's the example of how I did the design, going through the turf replacement rebate process for my front yard in Pomona, here in Southern California. And here's kind of the plug for the video series that we're almost done with that I mentioned. Hopefully by the end of January, that whole video series, step by step, which uses a lot of these images, they're kind of screenshots from it and goes way deeper. And the best way to find out about that is it'll definitely be in our newsletter when it gets posted. So sign up for our newsletter, cbwcd.org/newsletter. So here's my front yard. I kind of mentioned earlier, it's a weird kind of wedge-shaped front yard because it's on a cul-de-sac, about 1,200 square feet landscape area. So not huge, not tiny, but because of how all the houses are situated, especially around the other side, feels smaller than it actually is to some degree, because with the lawn being flat, it just feels like lots of different houses, whatever window I'm looking out of, or if I'm standing here, it's like 4 different houses at least are staring right at you, it feels like. So that's kind of right when things started. And so the first thing you're going to want to do is, one, spend some time in the yard observing, but also take some measurements. If you have a rectangular shaped yard or almost rectangular shaped yard with some little bump out areas or planters, that's going to be pretty easy. These wedge shaped lots are a little bit harder to translate to kind of like a scaled plan on graph paper. Couple of things you can do. You can really just estimate it if you want, and that will oftentimes give you close enough to get a planting plan in that, if you know that when you're going to put it out into the yard, it's going to be a little bit flexible. But there are also techniques to really make sure you get all of these angles perfectly, more than I can get into on this presentation. But definitely I go through all of that in those upcoming videos. Now, for some of you, you are just not going to go through this process of like putting it all down on graph paper. You are just not those kinds of people. I would recommend taking it on if you think that you might be up for it at all, because it's really going to help you get your exact plant counts, make sure everything's going to fit exact locations. If that is just not you, and I know some great garden designers who they just work more intuitively, they're not into doing the math. What you can do is I would recommend not necessarily Google Maps, but you can download this free program called Google Earth, which just allows you to zoom in closer. It's really a little bit of additional features. Zoom in as close as you can to see the whole space. Print it out. If you can print it out on 11 by 17 paper, even better. And you can do some rough sketches and just try to make it to scale. And if you do that, you can then get out there with like some little wood stakes, or even like I'm a fan of using the sprinkler flags that you can get from the landscape supply store that are the little kind of plastic flags on a little wire stake. And you can write on those with Sharpie, and you can kind of build out your landscape and then just be out there with a measuring tape and kind of build it in person, make sure you have the right spacing. And it's a little bit more of a process, but you can kind of do it more intuitively like that if you want, whatever's going to work for you. For the average person, here's what I recommend if you are up for it. And the math is actually quite simple if you have the average yard where it's just kind of a length and width and kind of a series of rectangles. And so you're going to translate that to graph paper. And this is, I always usually have like a pretty sloppy version of it. And then I try to make like one as neat as possible. So it doesn't need to be super neat the first time. The size of graph paper is going to depend on the size of your yard. And also how much of a space each square represents on your graph paper will depend on the size of your yard. So I almost always will work with 11 by 17 graph paper. Good art supply store will have it, super easy to buy online. And the typical graph paper, each square is 1/4 of an inch. Sometimes it's called 4x4 graph paper. If you want to, if it's going to help you out in your process, you can usually find 8x8 graph paper where the squares are smaller and each tiny square is 1/8 of an inch. For smaller yards, you can usually do 1 square. So 1/4 of an inch is going to equal 1 foot. So this, you can see my 1,200 square foot front yard. This just barely fits on with the different angles, a 11 by 17 sheet of graph paper where 1/4 of an inch equals 1 foot. For larger yards, and we often do see this, especially for backyards, 1 square at 1/4 of an inch needs to equal 2 feet. Or if you want to make it easier, you can get that 8x8 graph paper, which your local art supply store probably won't have, but again, pretty easy to order online. So hopefully that helps. And basically you can 11x17, you can kind of quickly do the math and figure out what size is going to fit for you. From when you get this base plan down, quick thing, as soon as you get this base plan, take a picture of it with your phone. Better yet, go to a copy machine, scan it, photocopy it a few times. You never want to have to draw this again because it is kind of a pain. And then you can work either on top of your copies or even better yet, work with multiple sheets of tracing paper. So get a matching size sheet of book of tracing paper, and then you can make mistakes. And if you have certain parts that you like and certain parts that you don't as you're working on your design, just kind of trace it out, move things around. You never have to redo your base plan. So from there, once you have your base plan, you're going to do site assessment, which is basically just a fancy way of saying getting down all your observations. And so you ideally want to be on your site through at least one good rain event. So if all of you are considering a specific site already, you just had that good rain event. So hopefully you kind of looked, were there problem areas? Were there areas that got a lot of water? Next week, we should be getting some more rain, hopefully. So if you didn't look this time, go out there. I am a huge fan of going out when it's raining, taking pictures, really kind of following the water around. It doesn't always do exactly what you think it's going to be doing. So we have some good chances coming up. Much harder to tell people to do that if it's in the middle of summer. What are the areas of sun and shade? Soil and drainage, do those drainage tests. As we talked about, you can check that at the workshop for that. What views are important? And this is, are there views from the property looking out? Like in our front yard, we happen to have a great view looking north of the local mountains. Not a lot of street trees in our neighborhood, which means it's really hot in the summer, but we have that great view. So that's a view that even as we put some small trees in, we made sure that those trees are going to frame the mountain view and not block it. It also might be things like, did your neighbor build a second-story addition that now looks directly down into your hot tub? Maybe you need some tall, narrow trees there to block that view. Where does water flow? Are there any specific microclimates? And so a microclimate is a particularly hot or cold area in your yard. Classic example in most front yards in our area is that little strip of plants closest to the edge of a asphalt or concrete driveway. It's going to be extra hot, even compared to the landscape like 20 feet away. The parking strip, if you have like that little strip in between the sidewalk and the street where it's just reflected heat from both sides, there are plants that might do perfectly well in the middle of your yard that just might not be up to that really, really hot area in the middle. That favorite plants for Inland Valley Landscapes workshop that I mentioned, where you can check the recording on YouTube, kind of talks about those hot microclimates and what's going to thrive there. So think about that. Are those going to be areas that you need to kind of address separately? Are there noise or other neighbor issues? Like you really need to find a place for a water feature to just kind of get that calming kind of stuff going on. Views you need to block, fences you kind of need to thicken up with maybe a hedge, or if you're going to build a fence, do it before you plant all your new plants and they start to grow in, so you don't need to trample them when you're putting the new fence in. And existing plants, including if there's any particular areas where you have really bad weed problems, you might need to spend a few months or maybe plant those areas next year, do some weed abatement. But more often than that, like, is there an existing, maybe a medium water use tree in your yard? That's a really lovely tree. If you have a big, healthy magnolia tree, that's never going to be a water-wise plant, but it might be worth keeping one zone under and around that tree that will continue to be a medium water area, mixing it with other medium water use plants, or plants that can tolerate medium amounts of water. Maybe there's a few, there's some low water plants that can take the extra water, but making sure that that beautiful big magnolia tree is going to stay happy. And then all the other stuff can go to being a water-wise plant in the front yard. And if you're working with drip irrigation, it becomes quite easy to give you can have one valve that turns on the drip irrigation to your medium water use zone and another valve that turns on the irrigation to your lower water use zone. And it doesn't need to be like a block of this in a perfect rectangle and a block of that in a perfect rectangle, like if you had sprinklers. So here's my site assessment. So there's a lot of conceptual stuff to think about, but when it comes down to like, what does that mean for your site? doesn't need to be that complicated. So in my front yard, I mentioned because of the cul-de-sac with just the flat front yard, front lawn felt too open. So I kind of drew like, what are the views that we want to not necessarily completely block, maybe in some areas, but at least obscure some. Got down on paper the mountain view. And it's important to get it down on paper because then when you start thinking about where the plants are going to go, and I love this plant and I love that plant, and maybe there's room for these different trees, it's easy to forget something as obvious as like, I want to keep the view of my mountains. So when I first moved to this property, we thought we're going to put a big old oak tree right in the middle of the front lawn, and it's going to be awesome. It'll just be this big shady oak canopy and it'll be lovely. And then we realized, well, actually, we want that mountain view. And then I also happened to realize doing some plumbing work that we had a poorly replaced, very shallow water main line, but I didn't want to redo the whole thing. So that's kind of a little too shallow to put a huge, 40-foot wide tree right on top of it. Most of the time you can put trees in your front yard, and as long as your water line and sewer line are in decent shape, it's not going to be any problem at all. And so here's my hot microclimate along my driveway. My gas line was deeper, but I happen to know where it is, so I just put it in to put it on the plan as well. And then because it's north facing, I mentioned there's that seasonally shady area. A lot of the year immediately north of the house, because the sun is somewhat even at noon in the south side of the sky, the north side of a structure is shady. But then in the middle of summer, July, August, it's full blasting sun. So I need to make sure, roughly within however many feet, just kind of estimating based on size of your house, what you've noticed, where that seasonal shade area is. And in that seasonal shade area, basically you're going to want plants that can take either sun or shade is the safest way to go. And it can make that transition. That's not most plants, but it's some of them. And then we had that flooding problem that I mentioned. And I do like to put on the kind of where the roof would be some little arrows to show how the water flows. In this case, it just flows off of the roof in every direction. But if we had rain gutters, maybe it would be along the gutter. I would definitely mark where the downspouts are, because that would probably be where I would collect water and bring it into my dry stream bed. And those are the main factors. So that's it. And then also at this point, I'm also going to have my goals. So my list of goals for this project, putting it down, literally write it down, keep it close by so you can't forget about it. My partner and my goals for this were for it to be beautiful, for it to be habitat for birds, butterflies, and pollinators, for it to be low water, to bring in that sense of privacy and shelter, to have it be that kind of what I consider the California dream garden, that natural beauty of California, working with native plants. We wanted to have blooms throughout pretty much the whole year, to have it smell amazing. There are so many native plants that smell great. And so whether it's in the heat of the summer where we smell the sages, or whether it's on our local rainy days where some of those smells just also kind of hang in the air with the moisture. Have a yard that smells great when we're walking from the house to the car, or walking back, or on a hot summer day with the door open and just the screen door closed. And then we keep the mountain view. So those are the kind of the main priorities. And so with our goals and with our site assessment, lay down a piece of tracing paper and start to kind of feel things out. So I'm not worried yet about individual plants, but I'm realizing that to keep my mountain view, instead of a huge oak tree like I first thought, maybe we're going to go with a couple of small trees that would kind of go along here. Additionally, thinking a lot about, I always put where the windows in the house are facing out, because for a lot of people, and us included, we're using the backyard as the social space. Our backyard is much larger than our front yard. And mostly we enjoy the front yard landscape when we're walking to and from our cars, and when we're in the house in these rooms that look out into it. So those views are super important, and framing those views. And so this view, which is from actually the room where we eat dinner, looking out, was mostly just our driveway and then our neighbor's driveway because of the angle. And so having a small multi-trunk tree here that will eventually become the main thing that we notice was really important. So the mountain view, to keep it open, and what views we kind of want to start to build and frame and obscure. Also thinking about in the design, kind of one tip that I think is really important for the visual aspects of the design is there a main direction that the landscape is mostly going to be viewed from to enjoy it. And so for the front yard for us, we realized that we want it to be lovely from the street, but mostly we're going to view the landscape actually from inside the house, looking out of all of these rooms. And so to build even more depth into the landscape, especially in a smaller, medium-sized yard, what you often want to do is your taller plants and your small trees might go kind of more towards the back, or your taller shrubs. And then you might have a medium layer. And then closer, you're going to have a smaller layer of plants. And by having those layers kind of step up, you psychologically build more of a sense of depth. And the garden feels larger than maybe it otherwise would have, than if you're putting kind of large shrubs like right in the middle of everything, or even especially like close to the pathways. Now, the exception is right up against the house, except for the windows that you might not want to block. You can also have some larger shrubs as well that will just kind of nicely frame the windows from both inside the house, if you see maybe just a branch or two, and then from the street looking at the house can kind of make the house look nicer. And so those were the kind of two big kind of first gestures we realized that we wanted. Here we did want a 6 to 8 foot tall hedge, because from this window especially, we just see the neighbor's gravel strip and the cars parked in their driveway. It's even more dramatic than you would even think looking at how the window is. Maybe it's just visually, it just pulls the eye that way. So we just wanted a taller, beautiful native hedge of plants that are going to attract birds and be a lovely backdrop for everything else. And then you just kind of keep working it through. Once you get the concept down, you can see kind of working through the concept of how the dry stream bed and French drain to deal with the water. And then from there, kind of thinking through, or maybe we weren't going to build like fancy pathways, deal with materials. We decided the pathway was just going to be the break in the plants, and it would just be wood chips like the rest of the mulch. But thinking about like, where would your pathways go? We actually thought, because it's a habitat garden, we were going to want a bird bath. And by putting our bird bath here, our cats, which hang out in both of these rooms, will be able to see birds in the bird bath from either room, as would we if we are in either room, because the best bird bath action often happens when you're in the house and not out there. They're a little bit more timid for a lot of the different birds when you're outside. And from there, then starting to think about, okay, what individual plants might you want to use? Working with the templates, working with the Inland Valley Garden Planner, working with other resources. If you're super into native plants, there's another great native plant specific online database called CalScape. That's a project of the California Native Plant Society. Any other plant lists or plants that you've seen at our demonstration garden, at other gardens that you've gone and visited, starting to draw those out. One of the really cool things is if you've done it, quote, to scale. Like, so on this one, we did it to where 1/4 of an inch equaled 1 foot. You can get something called the circle template, which has these circles of all sorts of different sizes. Make sure if you're doing it with 1/4 inches, you get one that's in inches, because they also have them in centimeters. And then you can, I like to use a Sharpie and make different notes of the actual sizes it would be to scale. So then on my little 1/4 of an inch circle, I write, make a dot 1 foot. My 1/2 inch circle, 2 feet, all the way up to like my 2-inch circle is 8 feet. And so the different sizes of shrubs, then it's really easy to, okay, it's a 4-foot shrub. Well, that's going to be my 1-inch circle. And then you could, instead of having to rely on just counting little squares, you can start to draw out, plants aren't going to grow as perfect circles, but roughly kind of get your ideas down really quickly. Oftentimes your first idea is not going to be your best one. So I love working on tracing paper, because you can go through a whole series of iterations, or do one day, and then, don't decide on your final design one day. Look at it a week later, relook up the pictures of the plants. If you can have your computer nearby with the pictures of the plants, even though you have your potential list, kind of go back and forth, make it kind of fun, have a cup of tea. I don't know, bring other people in on it, get other ideas. If you have kids or, husbands, ask them their opinion, get their buy-in, etc. And so just kind of working it through. And then as I go, I'll definitely, usually what I do is I just use the initials of the plants, and then I make a little key, a plant list as I go as well. Have a pencil with a good eraser, or just a separate eraser, you will be using it. And then it doesn't need to be a work of art. What I do is it's usually sloppy. It's erased. I will do one, I'll do another iteration. This is really the time to take all of your time. And then when I finally think I have what I'm going to do, then I do another layer where I try to draw. Again, it doesn't need to be perfect. It's not an art contest. It's just kind of a guide to what's going to work for you. But to look at it a little bit more clearly with contrast between the plants, I'll do a final trace. And then there's a lot of different colors, but it's a pretty cheap pack of colored pencils, totally optional. I just bought online. Don't need to do this unless you want to, but I like to just kind of roughly color code things. And kind of, if it's a block of plants, kind of group them. I'll go over it I normally just use like a super fine tipped Sharpie. You don't need a fancy art marker or a pen, and kind of lay that out. Stepping stone area, some different, cobblestones, maybe a few branches or logs, great for habitat, gives a nice rustic look. And then take a look at it. And then if you want to, you can kind of fill in mulch, do your plant key, all of that. We have many, many more resources about design information, including a California native garden design, just focused class, and a more general, especially we talk a little bit more about backyard spaces, social spaces, do-it-yourself landscape design online workshops, again, on our YouTube page. And then just to kind of show you, this is one concept. What we actually did was a little bit different for a few reasons that I won't get into, but a few different kinds of plants. Instead of a formal pathway, we did it's a native yarrow, a smaller basis plant that can take some foot traffic, a little area that we can walk out into, but just kind of keeps the space green when we're not out there. And here's how it goes, just quickly. Lawn, it's when we moved in, when we got started. Planting day, all 1 gallon and some even smaller 4-inch plants. See the French drain without the gravel in yet. I always like to put the gravel in first, so I'm not getting dirt and mulch in it, clogging up those spaces in between the pieces of gravel. This is it after it was planted. This is not lawn. These are just some seasonal weeds that we knew with our turf replacement or with our smothering method we were going to use. They were going to be no problem at all. So this is March. I didn't plant in the perfect time of the year just because I was kind of anxious to get it going. I didn't want to be the person moving into the neighborhood and saying I do landscaping professionally and then having a terrible front yard for a year. So, but knew we were getting into getting our mulch. This is mulch for a huge backyard as well. So don't worry, you don't need this much mulch for a small front yard. And then we worked with a process called sheet mulching using just recycled cardboard to accumulate boxes and have a biodegradable weed barrier that would last 6 months to a year and kind of smother any grass trying to come back up. 2 months. See, I plant small. You don't need to plant large. This is one of our trees planted from a tiny 1 gallon pot, Western redbud tree. 2.5 months after planting, you can see we're getting in the dry stream bed and then just starting to work with kind of larger rocks to kind of get a little bit more natural look as we go. At 5 months, you don't see the trees grown in yet. You don't really see the design intent. It's kind of a blob so far because all the plants are small. But at 5 months, you don't see just a lot of wood chip mulch. It's actually a garden. And you start to see spots of color coming in. California fuchsia, dry stream bed starting to grow in. We got the front yard certified as a wildlife habitat, which is something you can do through the National Wildlife Federation if you are into it. Doesn't change what's actually going on in your yard, but it's a self-certification and a small donation to them. And then you get this cool sign because our front yard is the first front yard in our neighborhood to look like this. And so people can know a little bit about part of the motivation and what's going on and what's happening in the yard. And if you build it, they will come. So that first year we had a little girl hummingbird move in and she would literally for weeks spend every morning hanging out on this one little specific dried grass stalk. And then she'd fly around, she'd chase off other hummingbirds, she'd eat little gnats and things like that in the garden. Super awesome. So here's trash day in the young kind of garden. Much more interesting to look at than the turf that was there before. Even if you know exactly what you're doing, if you plant a whole garden, you're always going to lose a couple of plants. So think, good place to reflect. Was it the right plant in the right place? Maybe it was, and try again. Maybe try something else. 6 months, starting to have these beautiful moments. 13 months, we got another mulch pile delivered for the backyard. So we used it to climb onto it and get a photograph. That's well on its way to being a garden. Our hedge is still going to grow in. Our trees are still going to grow in, but a lot of color, a lot of lovely stuff going on. And again, this may or may not be the look that you want. This is a kind of very wild garden, which I love, but still, even with a more formal garden, it's really going to get growing and going after about a year if you're doing the right plant, right place, looking up the size that plants are going to get, and all that sort of stuff, and can be a cascade throughout the year. So if you want to do your research, so here you can see our spring, and then in summer, same view, kind of replaced with a different series of plants that are in bloom. And so in our last few minutes, and I will say that we're running a little bit behind. I added a little bit of new content to the design, and it's taken a while. What we're going to do is we're going to talk very briefly about turf removal, and then very briefly about irrigation. And we make this class design heavy because we consistently find that that's where people need the most kind of starting information. Both of these next sections, we have entire online workshops about. We teach them once or twice a year online, but we also have them again at our YouTube page. And so for turf removal, we have our whole Removing Your Lawn the Right Way workshop, where if you're actually going to be doing it yourself, definitely check it out. If you decide from this what removal method you're most interested in, then you don't need to necessarily watch the whole thing. You can kind of click through to find it. But here's the basics. First, you want to get your lawn out. Funny thing about lawns, when you want them to be really nice and evenly growing, it seems like it wants to die and wants to have all these brown spots. But for most lawns of most of the turf types we have, once you decide, okay, I want it all to die, it still wants to keep growing back. Even if you stop watering for months, just a little bit of water, it'll be just enough to cause havoc all around your new plants. And so really doing a thorough job of killing your lawn as much as you can just pays itself off so much in terms of less hassles once you start irrigating your new garden for just your establishment watering. Basically, you want to identify your turf type. And it breaks down, you don't need to know the exact species, into two main types. Cool season grass is what most people intentionally plant. That's usually a tall fescue that's dark green, slightly broader leaf, green year-round, even in the middle of the coldest parts of winter. Marathon is like one of the trade names of a common turf blend. That's a cool season turf. If you have all cool season turf, good news is that that's the turf that requires the most water, really doesn't want to live in Southern California, and you almost can kill it by turning off the water for 3 months in the summer and then just digging it out. But no matter what you planted or what you started with, most of us, and this includes every single yard project I've ever been involved with in Southern California, have Bermuda grass in that lawn. So if you planted cool season turf, tall fescue, marathon sod, or something like that, and in the middle of winter, once it starts getting really cold, there are areas that turn kind of this color, maybe just a patch here and a patch there. No matter what you do, plenty of water, you fertilize. That's because that's Bermuda grass. And Bermuda grass just spreads all around the neighborhood because it's in your neighbor's lawns. It goes to seed very quickly in the summer. And if you pay someone to mow your lawn, that equipment is collecting all the seeds of all the different grass types and mixing them all around. Most people, unless they intentionally planted it, and it's really, really tough. So occasionally people don't have wall-to-wall Bermuda grass, but most of our lawns are just a big old mix of different types with significant Bermuda grass. It's kind of smaller, stringier leaves. If you have one of those lawns where if you don't mow for a week and a half in summer and you start getting seed heads that look like this, that's Bermuda grass. And it's really tough. It's a survivor. The roots could be a foot deep, and it can grow back from any little part of the roots because it can grow from seed. It can grow back from a little piece of a stolon, which is the stem that goes along the ground that has its own little roots, or a piece of the rhizome, which is the root part, which then also has its own kind of roots that creeps underground. So you never want to remove Bermuda grass with a rototiller because you're just kind of shredding up all sorts of different things and repropagating itself. So we'll talk about what to do. And then one of the other things that you might notice cropping up after your turf comes out. Most people with turf don't notice it, but nut sedge in some of our neighborhoods is all over the place. It might be living in turf. It's not a true grass. It's a weed pretty much in Southern California. And so if you can see here, it's slightly lighter and shinier. And if you see things like this growing back after you take your turf out, that's nut sedge. Just pull it as much as you can. You can also use cardboard mulch. Some of it will poke through. Just pull it as much as you can. Never let it do this and go to seed, and eventually you'll win out. So quickly, 3 methods. My go-to method is called sheet mulching. That's accumulating corrugated cardboard boxes, not the shiny stuff, but white, plain old brown. Largest ones you can get. A lot of times people will get them from like local bike shops. Small businesses need to pay to have this stuff recycled. They'll oftentimes let you have it. Bike shops, solar panel installers, a small appliance shops, auto body shops that get bumpers and things. I worked with smaller boxes, but most of mine, when I did it, there's a contractor a block away who does a lot of kitchens. I just told him, you have boxes, put them in my driveway, accumulated it. And so what you want to do is, if you have a small yard, to roughly kind of use a shovel and a pick to root out the turf is great. If you have a larger yard, might not be feasible. That's okay too. Water your yard really well, because when you put down this cardboard, you want to lock in that moisture. Let just the surface dry out for a day or two, so it's not, like walking around in the mud. Get your cardboard down, water that cardboard really well so that cardboard kind of slumps down, and you might have to do it in phases, one bit at a time. The cardboard kind of slumps down, conforms to the yard. It's not sticking up at the edges. And then you put down your mulch, whether it's wood chip mulch or gravel. Here we did wood chip mulch in the planting beds and the gravel path. There you go. If you dig out the lawn as part of that process physically, you can plant and sheet mulch at the same time. If you are using this to actually smother and kill the lawn, you're going to want to put down your cardboard, wait usually 2 months, and then the lawn starts to kind of rot out underneath. And then you can come back and plant by cutting through the cardboard. Provided way more details and tips and tricks on that in the workshop. If you are also removing the lawn physically and then just using this as kind of the weed barrier to prevent it from growing back, if you can't accumulate that much cardboard, you can also do it with rolls of paper from the hardware store. In the paint section, get the widest ones you can. Whether it's cardboard or the paper, you need a good overlap. Ideally 6 inches. I go for 9 inches of overlap if I have Bermuda grass. Only use the brown paper. The red paper that they have there has a waterproof layer, which is great for preventing paint spills on your floor, but not good in the garden. But it's not as effective as cardboard, and the cost can add up surprisingly quickly. I always go for at least 2, if not 3 layers, because it's much thinner and it doesn't last as long. I never recommend using this stuff, the woven plastic weed barrier. You can buy it at Home Depot. You can buy it at the landscape supply store. A lot of contractors use it because it's quick and simple. And for the first number of months, does a good job at preventing the grass from growing back. This stuff says that it allows air and water to penetrate. And at the beginning, it does. But what happens is that over a few years, usually by year 5, definitely later, sometimes even by like year 3, what happens is, especially wood chip mulch on top, breaks down, and instead of naturally improving the soil like it should, it clogs up all of those little pore spaces. This stuff, even though it's not really out in the sun usually, and shouldn't be breaking down, just does break down in the environment. And so weeds start growing on top of it, in between it, and then people are pulling out literally sometimes for the next decade just chunks of plastic as their roots don't get access to the air and water. It's just doesn't work in the real world long term. And so that's why I can't recommend it. So the sheet mulching is kind of my go-to. Method number 2 is solarization. That's literally steam sterilizing the top, usually about 4 inches of your soil. Can only be done in the inland heat. If you live on the coast, it's not going to work. Can only be done in full sun and needs to be done over at least 8 weeks in the middle of summer. So you're kind of limited on when you can do it. If you have those conditions, it can work. Again, you water really well because it's not just the heat, you need some steam to build up that heat. Water really well. And then you lay out this clear plastic that you get at the hardware store. Box is shown on the next slide. And you need to make sure that that plastic stays down tight, because if the afternoon breezes are making it flap around, you won't accumulate the heat you need to kill that turf and the roots. You really need to kill as much of the roots as possible. So to lay it down tight, bricks, I think there's some 2x4s folded in here, old plant pots with gravel or soil, rocks. Sometimes people will dig a little trench and fold it in and use some soil, whatever you need to do to get that down tight. The wider the sheet, the better, because the places where it overlaps also really need to be attended to. You want as few of those as possible. It will fry everything. So for example, this picture, which is a very clear picture, I wouldn't do it this close to the base of this shrub if I wanted this shrub to live, because this is going to be frying the roots of the shrub as well. So you might need to do a combination. Or if you have like the shade of a tree, that's not going to work. So here it looks like they probably combine maybe sheet mulching underneath the tree with the solarization farther away from the tree. And it's going to be in the paint section of the hardware store. Clear plastic. Black doesn't work. And 4 mil or 6 mil are the thicknesses that will work. 4 is kind of perfect. The thinner it is, the more heat gets through, but it needs to be at least 4 mil. The really thin stuff will just break down too quickly in the UV rays of the sun. And then if you're doing a large space, also sometimes look online, Lowe's or Home Depot, because you can sometimes special order and for free shipping to the store, like a wider cut. And so if you have a 20-foot wide space, you might be able to special order online a 20-foot wide roll that comes kind of folded up and have less seams and overlap. Both of these methods, and the next one, just digging out, none of them are silver bullets with Bermuda grass. That's sometimes while if possible, I'll combine digging out in a small yard with sheet mulching, or maybe solarization with sheet mulching. But I've also done just sheet mulching, and there's always a little bit that will come back up, and the key is just to pull it out as quick as you can. So I'm noticing that it's 8:30 now. I'm sorry, I'm going over a little bit. For those of you who need to leave, totally understand. We are recording this. It's all going to get posted. And even tomorrow, you'll be able to see all of this content, and the rest of it is on the current version that's already up online on the YouTube channel. So no worries if you need to take off. Hopefully the rest of you can stay for the next few minutes as we get through this. Turf removal, just digging it up, physical removal, is method number 3. That's great if you have a small yard and or you have young people with good backs, either at home or at your disposal. There's nothing really magical about it. The most effective way is just to do it with a shovel and a pick and just break out one little bit at a time. Shake as much soil off the roots as you can, because you want to leave that in your garden. And then just green bin or bring to the local green waste dump the rest of it. Sod cutters, I don't really like. They are an option. Sometimes contractors will use them. And if your contractor is going to use it and follow it up with something like sheet mulching, that's just fine. But the reason why is because Bermuda grass, if you have it, those roots can go down 8-10 inches or more. And a sod cutter, even on its maximum cuts, only going to bring out about 2 inches or so of soil. And then you have to pay to dispose of all of that soil. It can get really expensive. Even if you're doing the work yourself, just disposal costs and renting the machine could be about $1,600 to do about 1,000 square feet of space. I'd rather scrounge the cardboard, do the sheet mulching, and have my budget go towards putting the plants or the irrigation stuff in the ground. More kind of tips and tricks in the full turf removal workshop about if you're going to kind of dig it out yourself, kind of how to physically do that. And then the final method is caution if you decide to use herbicide. The most common herbicide used to remove turf is Roundup, or an off-brand, which is just glyphosate. It's looking like, and people are still arguing about the science, but there's a lot of lawsuits that have been won by the plaintiffs who have been bringing the lawsuits, that Roundup does in fact cause cancers, most specifically lymphoma. So not what I necessarily recommend to do. And if you are going to use herbicide to kill your turf, to get rid of Bermuda grass takes usually 4 applications spaced 2 weeks apart, even if you're doing everything right. At that point, that's 8 weeks. That's as long as it's going to take to do sheet mulching or solarization. So there's plenty of other organic or non-toxic ways of getting essentially usually just as much of an effect. If you're hiring a contractor, depending on your contractor, they might want to go with it, and I leave that up to you as to if you want to go that route, but hopefully they have training, use all of the precautions, and are making the informed decision to do that. I do not recommend it as a go-to for homeowners, but I mention it because if you go to a landscape supply store and you say, I have Bermuda grass, what do I do? This is what they're going to give you. If you are going to do it, research and wear your personal protective equipment, long sleeves, long pants, boots, minimum. Don't spray when it's breezy or windy because you don't want to breathe it in. And also, that stuff drifts in the breeze and it can get on your other plants. Roses, just for example, are super sensitive to it. If just a little bit gets on the breeze and hits your neighbor's roses, they will decline in health, maybe die, or just be miserable for years. The Bermuda grass is still going to be just as likely to come back as with some of the other methods. And so, that's a little bit about that 4th method, herbicide. And remember, whatever your method is, check out at least the cover of that method on the Removing Your Lawn the Right Way workshop, because we go way more into details, tools, tips and tricks, and all of that. And then last thing, quickly, just as the intro, you're going to need to make some changes to your irrigation system, because if you have a lawn sprinkler system, that's not going to evenly water your new landscape. When they just pop up 2 or 4 inches, they're going to hit the closest plant that's now taller than your turf, give that plant way too much water. Everything on the far side of that is going to stay too dry. We have a whole workshop about this process called Retrofitting Turf Irrigation Systems for Waterwise and California Native Gardens on our YouTube page. There's also a whole playlist by that title where I recorded supplemental videos. So if you're interested in the drip irrigation approach, step-by-step following me, close-ups of my hands as I put together a drip irrigation zone and do a sprinkler conversion. If you're interested in converting your spray sprinklers to be taller, to spray over your plants, kind of supplemental step-by-step videos that look at that as well. So that's really going to have the bulk of what you need. Just as the intro to start thinking, your 2 good irrigation options for a landscape renovation, if you want an automatic kind of system that's connected to a valve that turns on and off that you can schedule, are going to be retrofitting your spray system to, just like I said, be taller and more efficient, or to install a drip irrigation grid. There are plenty of bad options. A lot of the drip irrigation systems that we see homeowners put in with the best of intentions are just not robust systems. They're too quick to install. They are cheap and easy to install, but they just don't last. We always see problems with them. And the problem with putting in a too quick and easy but doesn't work well irrigation system is that that doesn't protect your investment in the plants that you put in long term. And so we really want to make sure that you're going to be successful. There's also a third option. If you want to be very involved with your garden, you can manually water either with a hose with an attachment or connecting to kind of like a fan irrigation system. But I have very specific recommendations on that. Also in the retrofitting turf irrigation systems, I have a whole section on manual watering. Most people do not want to be that involved on a daily basis or a weekly basis with the irrigation in their landscape. If you're going like real native plants, very minimal watering, that only becomes about once a month after your establishment period. And so for me in my backyard, I do have large sections where we have no permanent irrigation system. We just carefully use very well selected hose attached irrigation products about once a month, even in the summer, and hardly water at all in the winter. But in our front yard, because we have driveways, we have the street, we have that odd shape, I needed to go with a kind of more built-in irrigation system that's not going to overspray into the neighbor's yard, wet their car, waste water. And so these are the drip irrigation kinds of systems that we say avoid. In most cases, you're asking for trouble. We have a irrigation audit program where we'll help homeowners figure out what's going on with their irrigation systems, if they need to make any fixes, how to have their schedule set up. And we have never seen one of these little systems with the little spaghetti tube that doesn't have undiagnosed leaks, which usually means some plants are getting way too much water. And because the pressure is all off, other plants are getting way too little. So the two styles that we recommend, there's no perfect system. It's what's going to work best for your landscape and for you. Are retrofitting a spray irrigation system, which is one. That's what I did for my front yard. So taking most of the existing sprinkler locations, if they are laid out decently well, I could use a lot of them in my front yard, but I had to move about 5 of them. So in that full workshop, we show how to do that. And then instead of having little tiny pop-up sprinklers, putting them on solid pipe risers with different adapters that let the sprinklers spray over the closest plants and into the landscape. Now, this obviously only works if these stick out about 18 inches over the ground. So that's going to only work if our plants along the edge are under 18 inches. And you see them right at the beginning, but as the garden grows in, they're right there, but they're basically not that noticeable. And actually we get some birds that sit on here and perch and then go hunt little insects and stuff. So they're kind of cool to have around. If you are thinking about a spray irrigation system, one thing to know, and this is your chance to fix it, is that the way spray irrigation systems are designed to work, whatever kind you have, whether it's old school turf irrigation system or high efficiency like we're talking about, is each sprinkler should basically be placed where its spray goes far enough to basically hit the center of the next closest sprinkler. So there's multiple overlaps. That's how they're engineered to work and give even watering. Sometimes we see that there's just one head and the edge of that spray barely touches the edge of the other spray. That's not how they're designed to work. You want what's called head-to-head coverage with the water. Again, we talk way more about that in the full workshop. And then you're going to want to put in what are called high-efficiency rotating sprinklers, which instead of the typical like misting old school spray system, these are concentrated streams of water, some that go farther, some that shoot closer, and they rotate around. So instead of a little breeze blowing all of that off, it gets much more of the water to where it's intended. And in fact, if you're doing the turf replacement rebate program, didn't mention all of the details, definitely check those out. But one of them is if you're going to continue to have spray sprinklers, they need to be retrofitted to be these high efficiency rotating nozzles. Or you can completely cap all the sprinklers off and hand water, or you can convert to drip irrigation. If you are going to do drip irrigation, the type we recommend is called a drip irrigation grid using what's called inline drip line. And what that is that's a tube that usually homeowners will buy 100-foot rolls. You're going to need much more than one roll if you're doing a whole yard. You can also do 250-foot rolls sometimes if you're going to the landscape supply store. For contractors, they make bigger rolls, but those get kind of hard to work with for the average homeowner. And those rolls of inline drip irrigation, you see these little holes here. Those are not just holes in the tube. Those are actually highly engineered individual emitters. So when the irrigation system turns on with the proper setup, which includes a pressure regulator and a filter, again, we break down all of those parts in the full workshop. They all regularized, have kind of the same pressure, and they let water out at the exact same rate all along that tube. So it's a highly engineered system. And it's much more robust because instead of all these little things that are plugged in and little tiny fittings and little fragile tube, it's just this bigger tube and these more robust fittings. And so it's not going to like fall apart when you walk through the landscape. Really important. Occasionally things might get cut. There is some maintenance. You need to test it every once in a while and you might need to fix things, but it's night and day compared to the other systems. This is how almost 100% of commercial drip irrigation systems are put in because it's what is feasible to like last. And I will always do drip irrigation in a small planter like this, a parkway planter. Narrow areas, spray systems are just always going to spray out into the street, onto the sidewalk. For a larger landscape area, it just depends on the design. depends on who's going to be living there. So you saw in my front yard, I did spray, but this is what that would look like for a larger area. That's why it's called a grid. You're literally creating a grid of those emitters. And when you run it, depending on your soil type, you might not see all of that moist area connecting at the soil surface. But as the water goes down into the soil, if you set it up right for your soil, and I provide some guides in that full workshop about how to do that, by the time you get a few inches down, that will basically be like all the soil in the root zone is wet, as if it had rained. It just wasn't shooting through the air. The nice thing about this is that you don't need to worry about plants blocking the height of your sprinklers. So you can have trees, you can have shrubs, all of the root zone is going to get evenly watered. That's the biggest advantage. And so if you have pathway areas or areas where there aren't going to be plants, you don't need to necessarily have the drip go through those areas. But everything that's going to be kind of your main planter area or root zone, you just kind of grid that out. Yes, it's more materials, and yes, it's more expensive to install, but that is so much better going to lead to good plant health and having your plants not only grow well, but actually live past their first few years, where those other systems just do not support the long-term health of the plants. So shouldn't really be an option for most people, in my opinion. Now, there's details depending on how you set it up, and the size of your yard. Sometimes you will go back to connecting to the valve and actually having like a pipe that goes along the whole part of the planting bed and then connects in individual areas to that drip zone. Or sometimes you can actually cap most of your sprinklers and then just have these adapters that will use all of the underground pipe from your sprinkler system, and then just in 2 or 3 places adapt to this. And so you might not have to dig any trenches at all. And so in that full workshop, we kind of go through, I use my front yard as an example again, step by step. What would it look like to go from the existing sprinkler system? And we show pictures. What would a plan be for the spray system? Show you what I did. What would different options be for drip systems, including some of those adapters that I was talking about? How does that all work? And so just to conclude with the last slide, at this point, people have lots of ideas. We've connected you with the resource, but people like to often review. So like, what's the order of things? What do I do in what order again? So remember, it starts with your goals. You're going to think about your goals for your site. How do you want to use your yard? How do you want to use that space? What's the perfect garden for you? What does that feel like? Your site observations, your budget, and then start to think about your design. Go out, get inspiration, look at other gardens, check out all the resources online, go to garden tours, go to botanical gardens. And if you're working with a contractor, next step, talk to multiple contractors, get multiple quotes, check those references. Get on their schedule early if you can. Turf replacement rebate application, if it is applicable, has to get in, has to get approved. That's going to take a few weeks before you start to kill your turf. Then you're going to want to kill the turf, prepare the site, any soil moving, so digging that dry stream bed out. Then you're going to have some extra soil. Maybe you can make some interesting mounds, get a little extra drainage for some of your water-wise plants. Do something interesting with that. Shouldn't have to put soil in the trash ever. You can always find a use for it on the site. Turf killing is best done in the warm season because that Bermuda grass can kind of go dormant in the winter, and you won't know if it's dead or if it's just kind of not growing back because it's kind of dormant in the winter. If you can, kill the turf in the summer. Primary irrigation system work, anything you have to do with valves, piping, anything like that goes next. If you're going to be doing a spray system, you can finish all your irrigation system work before you do any planting. If you're doing a drip system, you have a couple of options. You can either run all of your drip line and then just kind of push and poke things here and there as you are planting, or you can make sure everything is in except for running that flexible brown tube and have your adapters in, your header in, your valve work done, then plant. And immediately after you're done planting, like the same day or the next day, run all that brown tube and then get that system going. Then you're going to be doing your planting, best done late fall to early winter if possible, definitely by the end of March if at all possible. Even water-wise plants do not want to be planted in July and August, especially inland. Then if you're doing for your drip system, any of that final irrigation system work is necessary. Then you're going to be doing your cleanup, your mulch, your final touches, putting in your bird bath, putting in your bench, all that sort of stuff. And then you're going to move into that first year of establishment care to enjoy watching your garden grow in. And so for all of that, on our YouTube page, we have other resources to support. In the fall, we always teach them live, kind of in the right time of year. We're a little bit kind of coming in at the end of it, but still plenty of good time to work. So we recently have planted. We have a installation and establishment for California native and water-wise gardens class that will kind of walk you through, the best ways to plant, planting techniques. A lot of people realize after they've gone through that class, they tell me they thought they knew how to plant a plant, but they learned kind of how to do it properly, especially for water-wise or native plants. So definitely check that out. Installation and establishment for native gardens. And then we also have a class that is, I'm going to get the name wrong, but it's basically choosing, selecting and planting water-wise and native plants. We have that online, but also in the new year, either in January or February, I can't remember. It's up on our Eventbrite page. I'm going to be teaching that as one of our first live in-person classes back in the demonstration garden. In the new year, we're actually going to start doing, for the first time in a long time, some outdoor-only classes in the demonstration garden. So we will look at what is a healthy plant, what is an overgrown plant that you might see at the nursery, what to avoid, what to get, how to plant, all that sort of stuff. And so with that, thank you for everyone who stayed. I am going to answer any of the questions that came in. If you have more questions, let me know. And I am also going to launch a very quick, just 4-question closing poll, which is super useful to me. Let's me know how we're doing. Thank you very much to those of you who stayed. Obviously, the tweaks that I made for this workshop made it a little too long. So hopefully it was worth it for all of you. But the reason why we sometimes do that is because we're always tweaking things and trying to improve it based on the feedback and provide people with the most useful information, not just to provide pretty pictures, but to actually empower you to take next steps in your process. So have the poll. And love comments as well. If there's definitely, because this was running long, if there's anything I presented that you think maybe you didn't necessarily really need to know or in that much detail, I would definitely love to know that. Or if there's anything that you learned tonight that you're going to use for sure, please let me know and I'll make sure not to cut that out of the workshop. So the only question that I see right now is there a list of contractors to pick from who can do the work? Great question. After design, finding a contractor for people who are looking for contractors is usually the next kind of hurdle. We are a public agency. And so as a public agency, I don't provide formal recommendations for private businesses. That being said, I have right now a very limited list, and I am working to try to expand that list of local contractors that people have used for that landscape design assistance program. So if you're in kind of very eastern Los Angeles or western San Bernardino County, that area, contractors that people have used and they've reported having good experiences with them. So not a recommendation, but definitely, do all of the work, checking references, but I have a small list of people that I can informally share, not as a recommendation. And I will do that over email. And what I am putting in design at CPWC, I'm putting in to the chat right now an email address that's monitored by both me and one of the other people on my team here at the Waterwise Community Center. And so for anyone who's here, if you want that local list of contractors that have done projects for people in our design assistance program, feel free to email me at that address and I will email you that list that I do have. If any of you know people who have had great success, or if you end up having great success and you have a recommendation, please let me know and I'd love to add them to that list. Okay, and I see a question from Jorge. I've used cardboard and wood mulch method in my yard. I have 4 fruit trees along with some native plants. If I understand correctly, I'm unable to get a rebate for that area. That if you've already done that work, that is correct. The rebate is for existing turf, green or brown, going out at the time you apply, and then doing the process from there. Because it's a program aimed at the funding is to motivate that behavior change, and so of taking out the turf. It's to kind of like push people who might be thinking about that over the edge to make that step to take out the turf. Okay, and that is pretty much it. I don't see any other questions. I will hang out. If any of you are able to finish the survey who have not finished, that would be super useful, or any other comments. Again, anything that didn't work for you or that you thought was super useful into the chat would be awesome. And other than that, I hope you, again, sign up for our newsletter. I will put the link to do that into the chat one more time to hear about all of everything that we have coming up. Sign up for our other workshops and come check us out in the demonstration garden. And with that, I'll hang out just in case any other questions come in. And if not, have a good evening, everybody.